Hey gang, welcome to this mega run of the Best of Uncle Josh's Part 2. I did something like this back in August and thought, what the heck, I'll put something together again. A couple hours of stories that if you are a faithful listener you've already heard but might enjoy hearing again, and if you have never heard them, I hope that you will dig them. As always, if you have a story that you would like to hear on this YouTube channel, send it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. So whether you're cutting the grass or maybe clearing out the driveway of some snow, or just relaxing or getting ready to fall asleep, here's a couple hours of the best of Uncle Josh's true scary stories. Let's get it on. A bizarre abduction. My old roommate's dad was a former naval officer and then an FBI agent. 20 years in the Navy and 12 or 15 years or so in the FBI. One of his strangest stories was from his FBI days, and I'll paraphrase it here. It was a kidnapping case. This girl disappeared from her grandparents' RV sometime between 5 p.m. and midnight. They were up in front on the road, and the next thing they know, she was gone. She was supposed to be sleeping in the back. One stop at a rest stop, then they were in stop-and-go traffic, so they figure she must have popped out the door at some point. This happened near the California-Nevada border. So we met them again and talked to them, and this is within a day or so and the girl's still missing. No sign of her. She was only 15. Local PD theory is she ran off because she's 15 and wants to get away from her lame grandparents for the summer. But there's a busted window with glass inside the vehicle, so we're treating it like a possible kidnapping. After a few hours, there's a couple of different theories on the case still. Again, one that she ran off, another that she got snatched. Nobody's seen the girl in almost 2 days now, and disappearing in the desert for a young girl is not an easy thing to do. Next thing you know, we got a phone call. A report of a naked girl, lost and confused, picked up by some trucker on a 2-lane road out in a town called Nipton. It runs into I-15 between Barstow and Vegas, right near the border. She matches our description, so me and 3 guys head out there to meet with the sheriff who's got her. Turns out she's our girl. Turns out she's fine. No bruises, no exposure, no rape, nothing. Completely healthy. Completely fine. Even cleaned up like she just took a shower. Wouldn't tell us a damn thing because she couldn't remember a damn thing. According to her, 1 minute she was in the RV, and the next she was naked walking down the side of the road in 100-degree heat. We talked to her for 2 hours while her grandparents headed out to pick her up. We had our social services lady talk to her. Nothing. Over my career, I've seen people hiding things. This girl wasn't hiding anything. She honestly didn't remember. Damnedest thing. Anyway, the girl was found, she was fine, so we turned her back over to the local PD to figure out what happened and determined if any charges needed to be pressed. I kept in touch with a guy I knew out there because I was curious to hear what would happen with this story, and we also happened to be in a fantasy football league together. A few months later, he told me the parents sent the girl to a therapist to look for repressed memories to make sure she wasn't raped or something. The therapist said she seemed fine and honestly had no recollection of her time at all, and doesn't think there's any point to delving much further into things, and she has no symptoms and is largely more confused by the reaction than the event. So, to this day, we've got a busted RV window with glass on the inside, likely from a moving RV on a jam-packed freeway or something, likely in broad or lightly fading sunlight, and 0 witnesses. A 15-year-old gets out, or is taken out, and is taken somewhere safe nearby for almost 2 days, and then is stripped naked without being touched sexually, cleaned up, and deposited on the side of a separate road a few miles away. She didn't have a drug in her system. She remembers nothing at all, and nobody knows what happened to her clothes or anything else. It's been almost 20 years since this happened, and I can't figure out what the hell went on with that girl. It still bugs me at night that I have no way to explain it aside from saying that she just lied the entire time. But I know liars, and I am sure she wasn't lying at all. Would-Be College Kidnappers by Taylor Dr. A little background. My dad is a police officer, ex-military, and my mom is one of those types of people who worries about literally everything. This led them to teaching me how to behave in a variety of potentially dangerous situations, from code words to self-defense. I wish I were kidding, but we even have a plan for zombie apocalypse, literally any potential disaster, and we've discussed it. Fortunately, I lived a very safe life and did not have to use their advice very often. I am also an incredibly light sleeper. Even a text vibration on my phone wakes me up immediately. During the summer before my third year of college, I was living with a good friend of mine. We can call her E. E was very book smart, but somehow had zero situational awareness, as well as a horrible tendency to be the most annoying person you've ever met in your life after having one drink. At the time of this story, I was 20 and she was already 21. This led to a few nights of me getting pissed off, because she would want to go to the cooler bars her other friends wanted to go to, but that I couldn't get into with my shitty fake. This particular night, we had talked about going out and had even gotten ready together. Then, right before we were supposed to leave, she switched it up and decided she was actually going to meet her other friends at a bar I couldn't go to. And with an, "Oh, I'm so sorry." I wasn't able to tell her she can't do something, but I walked away visibly pissed and went to bed early. I woke up at around 3 because I had received a few texts in a row. Knowing it was her, I was extremely tempted to turn over and go back to bed. I decided to quick check and see what she wanted and saw multiple separate texts from E that said things like, "OMG! Wake up! Please wake up! I'm in so much trouble. Please help me!" Unfortunately, I've gotten a new phone since this happened and don't have access to the original texts. I asked her what was happening, and she tells me with lots of misspellings because, well, alcohol, that her friends had left her at the bar. They didn't answer when she tried to call them, and that when she was standing outside the bar trying to call her friends, 2 older guys asked if she needed help. She told them that she was just trying to get a hold of her friends so she could go home. To this day, I question why she didn't just order an Uber when she realized she was alone, but again, alcohol. These 2 men point to a car and say it's their Uber, and if she'd like to go, they don't mind dropping her off at home. E decides this sounds like a great idea and gets into the car with them. One guy sits up front with the driver, and one sits in the back with E. This is obviously when things start to go south. E notices that they appear to be going in the wrong direction, and makes a comment that she lives the other way. No one says anything to her. Now, the car has gotten onto a major highway that you would take if you wanted to leave our large city for the neighboring large city approximately 45 minutes away. This is the point where she started texting me for help. I tell her she needs to speak up, but she keeps telling me that she's too afraid to say anything. I tell her to say that she's going to be sick. No Uber driver will want you puking in the car, and will pull over so you can get out. This is what my mom had drilled into my head as a kid. If you don't like something someone is doing in a car, tell them you're going to be sick. E refuses because she's too afraid. She finally asks where they're going, and they say a large city. And she tells them, "No, I live in the other city." And the guys laugh and say, "Well, just think of it as a suburb of your city." Now, E has gone into full panic mode. I have already run out of the house and am attempting to follow them. I have her sending me to her location on her iPhone repeatedly so I can try to catch them. I'm telling her to get the fuck out of the car and do not get back in. I was flying down the highway, but they still had maybe a 20-minute head start. I wanted to call the police because, 1, we obviously need help, and 2, I'm driving in excess of 100 miles an hour down the highway and do not want to be pulled over. Unfortunately, E can't give me a description of what car she's in. No color, no make, nothing. I don't know how she finally spoke up or what she even said, but she was able to get the Uber driver to stop at a gas station that was, quite literally, the only thing around. Like it was an exit to a gas station, just to enter back onto the highway. There was nothing else in the area. She's texting me to tell me they're pulling into a gas station, and I tell her to get her ass into a bathroom stall, lock the door, and do not move until I get there. And if she can't do that, go stand next to the clerk and tell him to call the police, because she does not know these men, but I swear to God, E, don't get back in the car. I don't care if they carry you kicking and screaming, you fight tooth and nail to stay out of that car, I told her. But of course, this is E, and she didn't listen. She instead chose to hide behind the gas station. At this point, I was just minutes away and figured I could get there before they went looking for her. Alright, I was a 20-year-old female, average to shorter height and average weight. Athletic, but not a hulk by any means. So I have no idea what I thought I would be able to do to these two 30-year-old guys or whatever, and their Uber driver. I had also run out of bed without getting dressed, so I was wearing fleece Guitar Hero pajama pants and a sports bra. No shoes. I pull into the gas station parking lot, and their car is the only one there. I got out of my car and marched up to the one standing by the gas station wall and quite literally went toe-to-toe with him, and in my best, low, cold, furious anger voice, asked him where E was and what the hell he thought he was doing. This grown man couldn't look me in the eyes and didn't bother speaking, but rather pointed to the back of the building. I yelled to E to get out here right now. We are going home. She comes around the building wearing only her bra and jeans, no shirt. I put her in my car and turn around to start yelling at the men, but as I turned, their Uber was already squeaking tires to get out of the station. E and I had a very quiet ride home, and I turned into my mother and told her that I wasn't mad at her. She was crying and apologizing to me, but I told her she was safe now, but that next time she needs to react quickly and speak up for herself, because who knows what could have happened. Oh, and she didn't have a shirt on because there was a hill behind the gas station that she fell down and into a bramble patch. Her shirt was covered in stickers. This story isn't as outright terrifying as most of the ones I read about, but thinking about what could have happened had I not caught up with them, and just how easy it was them to do this chills me to the bone. So, to my two would-be rapist kidnappers, let's not meet for your sake. Alien Encounter, submitted by Ron Ray. This took place between 1989 and 1997. Many things occurred over this period of time, and other things happened before this. It's a long story. Forgive me for taking up so much space, but I feel it necessary to explain the entire sequence of events. If it's too long to read, I certainly understand and don't blame you for going on to another story. The time surrounding this particular series of events began around July 1989. This is not to say that July 1989 was the first time I had paranormal activities in my life, but the things that I'm about to convey to you now began around that time. And although the things that I'm posting happened over a long period of time, I feel they are related, or I would not have placed them here. It began with an evening out at an American Legion post in Guntersville, Alabama. I had gone out with my brother and his 12-year-old son to the local American Legion post, where they were holding dart-throwing contests. Not actual tournaments, but just open games where anyone could enter the competition. After an evening of mediocre games at best, we felt it was time to get back to his house so that his son could get ready for school the next day. Also, the American Legion closed at 10 p.m., so there was actually no other choice. We left the Legion around 10:05 and made a quick stop at a convenience store. After that, we drove to his house, which was approximately 8 miles away. He lived in a rural area that is very sparsely populated, and the road to his house had no houses for miles. About halfway there, we stopped to use the bathroom, which is something most country boys in Alabama do without even thinking twice. The bathroom consisted of a patch of weeds on the side of the road with no traffic. Anyway, I add this bit of information only to establish a relative time frame for the trip from the Legion to his house. The trip, including the stops at the convenience store and the weeds, should have taken no longer than a half hour at most. I went back over the route the next day, and it took less than 25 minutes. When we arrived at his house, his wife came out and asked why we were so late. We didn't understand what she meant until she said it was after 12:30 in the morning. We both said that was impossible, until we checked our watches. She was right. Not really understanding any of this, I departed and went home. The next morning, as I was putting my socks on, I noticed a pink scar on the inside of my ankle about the size of a small pencil eraser. I looked at the other ankle and there was another one, identical to the first in shape and size and location, except it was on the opposite foot. The marks looked like scars, but I had never seen them before. They appeared like two small gouges of skin had been scooped out and now had healed over, although they were not there before, I am sure of that. The marks were approximately 6 millimeters in diameter and 2 millimeters deep. They were cup-shaped. This, along with the time missing on the night before, really had me wondering what the hell was going on. I immediately got in my car and retraced our trip from the night before, stopping at both the store and the side of the road where we took a piss. I was reenacting everything we had done the night before, and there was no way the trip could have taken over 25 minutes. But it was evident that over 90 minutes of our lives were missing, not including the stops and actual drive time. I went over all the details with my brother, his wife, and his son, and there was no deviation in accounts of the trip and times of the event. This was perplexing, but there was nothing we could do about it. At the time, there was no reason to do anything, but a few nights later, I had a very vivid dream of 3 tall beings who I thought were doctors. They were standing over me, examining me, and several smaller things were watching off to the side. I was on a metal table with platforms on my sides, so my arms were outstretched at 90 degrees, like a flat metal cross. There was a table of sorts to the right of my head, and I was lying on my back, and all 3 tall doctors or whatever were to my right, while there were several shorter, darker beings seated behind a small 2-foot-high wall to my left. There was a strong light above me, but I couldn't actually see a light. One of the tall ones to my right said, as if instructing the smaller ones, "This would normally be terminal." And that's all I can remember of that. Fast forward a couple of months. I found a beautiful house for rent on a bluff overlooking several miles of the Tennessee River, north of Gunnersville, Alabama. The house was beautiful, but very isolated. There were only a few houses within a quarter of a mile, honestly, like 3. It was about 1/8 of a mile down to a little gravel drive that dead-ended at the house, and there was nothing around the house but woods and a cliff overlooking the river. The house had not been occupied for a long time, which I found strange because of its beauty and location, but there was a little work that was required to get it up to code. The view of the Tennessee River was blocked by several small to medium trees that had grown up between the backyard and the bluffs. One of the first things I did was start clearing those trees so we could see the river from the second-floor deck. As I cut one of the wild cherry trees, it was evidently in a bind, and I didn't realize it. When I made the first cut after it fell to the ground, the trunk sprang back and struck me in the chest, and I was knocked to the ground, almost unconscious. Immediately upon getting back up, I realized that the impact with the tree trunk had broken some ribs on my left side. I went to the doctor, who confirmed that I did have 2 broken ribs over my heart, about 1 inch to the left of my nipple. He also said because of this, I would get pneumonia, and when I asked why, he said that because I was a smoker, I would favor those ribs and not cough, causing a buildup of phlegm in my lungs, and therefore causing pneumonia. I then saw that he was right, because I hadn't coughed much since the accident. Look, I know this is dragging, but I promise there's a purpose to everything I'm talking about. Because of what the doctor said, I had to force myself to cough after that. The night after the doctor visit, I was asleep in my recliner in the living room. I couldn't bear the pain to lie flat in bed, and I awoke in the middle of the night and went to the bathroom. On the way there, a loud sound scared me so bad I jumped at least 4 feet in the air. The sound was like in the movies when a spaceship takes off. It was a whirring sound, just for a few seconds, and then it faded off and then went straight up. It was pleasant outside, so the windows were open, and I first wondered if I had just been dreaming, but my dogs were barking outside, telling me that it wasn't a dream. The dogs had heard the same sound. After composing myself, I finally got to the bathroom to complete the mission that woke me up to begin with. Standing there, I knew I had to cough, so I prepared myself in the now familiar fashion of folding my arms around my chest and braced for the excruciating pain. I coughed. No pain. I coughed again. No pain. This was wonderful. I must have coughed 20 times. As soon as the elation died down, I began to wonder why there was no pain. I looked down and saw a small hole that was burned into my shirt, directly over where my broken ribs had been. I had always carried a pen in that pocket, and upon further inspection, I found that the burn had gone through my shirt pocket and into the Pilot V pen. Not all the way through the pen, but deep enough that I wondered why it wasn't leaking. I still have that Pilot V pen with the melted spot on it. I don't know what healed me, but it did. It mended my ribs. I was now healed. After that healing encounter, strange things began happening on a regular basis. My wife and children witnessed many events that, had I not been there, I would have had a hard time believing. Once my daughter said that there were men outside of her window, which was on the ground floor. They had flashlights that shone through the curtains and into her room. This room overlooked the bluffs. There were never any people around that house. I know that for a fact. But my 8-year-old son also said that little men led him out during the night and showed him their spaceship. He actually drew a ship that he said was in the front yard. He said that as they were leading him out, I was sitting in my chair as if in a trance. My eyes were open, but I didn't react to him and help him as the beings led him outside. One time I found him outside asleep on the floor by an open door downstairs. My wife dreamed that beings other than human transported her to another place, and I would regularly dream of interaction with aliens. I set up a mini tape recorder that used the small cassette tapes before the time of solid-state memory. I set it on voice actuated so that it would automatically record when a sound activated it. The next morning when I checked it, there was a strange noise at the beginning, kind of like dishes breaking, and then 60 minutes of white noise. I tested it over and over, and it always turned on when there was no sound. We began seeing lights outside at night. The lights would travel at a very slow speed, very fast speeds with no sound. These lights were within a 3 to 5 mile radius over and inside the Tennessee River below. Approximately 5 miles across the river below us was another mountain, the same height as the one we lived on. It was on these mountains and their slopes where the lights occurred. On the mountain directly across the river was a small town and community called Fife. This is in a different county from the one we lived in, but we could see the activity from our mountainside. Anyway, it's about 5 to 7 miles from the house that we were in, as the crow or UFO flies, as it were. So we could see some activity that they couldn't, because it was on the slopes or in and around the river. I watched some of those lights go down to the river and then beneath the water, and you could see a dim light when they went under, but sometimes they would come out and sometimes the lights would disappear. One morning, after a real busy night of light activity, there was an Army helicopter that came up the bluffs, as if searching for something. And when it got within 100 yards or so, we could see right inside it, because it was at the same level of our house. And there were men inside, and they were soldiers, and they acted like we weren't even there. And that was all about that. After that, the local television station started reporting people seeing a black helicopter right before several cow mutilations. This happened several times, but I don't know whatever became of that. People that visit us would say they could feel a difference at our house. When things got quiet at night, I could hear an extremely low-pitched rumble that sounded like a bulldozer, but like it was underground. There were flocks of hummingbirds. One even built a nest right by the second-floor deck that we always spent time on, and I watched as she raised 2 little babies. And there were also hundreds of bats that roosted in our attic. In the evening, they would dive out of the attic, above the sliding glass door so we could count them, and they would just fly into the surrounding woods. It seemed that all these types of wildlife, including spiders and scorpions, were drawn to this house. This activity continued for several years until I finally moved out in 1997. It was a combination of my deteriorating health and, sadly, my deteriorating family. I really can't remember everything, but I know there was a lot more to this story. I mean, a lot more. Sadly, since then, my home has dissolved. My daughter joined the Air Force and has refused to come home. My son began to get straight F's at school and dropped out, and sadly, I don't know where he is now. My wife left me and now lives in a different state. There is something hanging above all of our heads that haunts our memories and our dreams, and it has destroyed my family and has almost physically destroyed me. I once considered hypnosis to quit smoking, but refused for fear of remembering things that I don't want to know. I'm sure that if my son, daughter, or wife were here, they would say, you're not telling half of what happened. But this is all I can tell for now. It's more than I've been able to talk about for many, many years. The suit. When I was a sophomore in college, I had a formal event to go to and needed a tux. I was over at a friend's one day, and she told me she needed to get her roommate a birthday present, and suggested we go over to an antique and vintage clothing and jewelry store just a few blocks away. I told her I might find a tux there, so off we went. As my friend looked at costume jewelry in several cases, I went back to the men's section of the small store and looked for a tuxedo. I didn't find one, at least not one I liked. But I did find a classic pinstripe suit, black with gray stripes. I liked it and looked at the price. $42. Something I could afford, and I could use a suit anyway. I was in a couple of student organizations that called for a suit from time to time. I tried it on, and except for the pants needing some hemming, it fit pretty well. I bought the suit and took it home. Alas, I lived at home during college. I told my mom about the suit, and she asked to see it. So we went up to my room, and I showed her the suit and tried on the jacket. My mom was checking the jacket out, feeling the quality of the lining and that sort of thing. She reached into the pocket and pulled out a small card. There were some words typed on it. I couldn't see. My mom looked very, very confused and asked me where I had gotten it. I told her I got the suit at a shop downtown, and she asked, "No, where did you get this?" showing me the card. I read the words on that card, and I felt the blood run from my face. I told her I'd never seen it before. She told me I must have, and I swore I'd never seen it before, and if it was in the suit, it was in the suit when I bought it. She said that was impossible, and we went back and forth like this for a few minutes. My mom was confused and freaked out. The next day I went back to the shop where I'd purchased the suit and went to the counter and spoke with the woman there. I asked her where she got her clothes, and she told me that she got a lot from thrift stores and places like that. She also told me that her sister owned a similar store in Ohio. I started to go a little numb then. Chillicothe. I know I went numb then. It was the numbness that comes out when we learn something that is almost impossible, but has still happened. I went numb because I was born in Portsmouth, Ohio, a few miles from Chillicothe. My father was also born and raised in Portsmouth. In 1969, almost 8 months before I was born, my father died in a boating accident on the Ohio River. His name was Bill Atkinson, and obviously I never met him. The card in the pocket of the suit jacket was a membership card for the National Honor Society. According to the card, it had been issued in Portsmouth, Ohio, and on it was his name. 20 years after his death, and 500 miles away at a random shop unconnected with anything else in my life, I had purchased my father's suit. Babysitter Trouble, submitted by Powerplant 56. This happened to me and my brother when I was about 8 and he was 6. I'm calling myself Brian and my brother Jake. It wasn't for another few years that we were allowed to stay home alone, so, like everyone else in the world, we had babysitters. For 1 year, we had this guy that lived up the street who would watch us, and he was awesome. His name was Jim, and he would let us stay up late and would crank rock records with us and tell us dirty stories and jokes right before we went to sleep. I think he was the first guy to tell us the Cheech and Chong Dave's Not Here Man skit, and Jake and I would laugh and always ask him to tell it more than once. Honestly, that still makes me laugh. He was like 17 or 18, and we thought he was the coolest guy in our neighborhood. I think he went into the military. I can't remember at this point, but he wasn't our babysitter anymore. We got this really hot girl for a little while, and she was seriously the woman I based all my teenage fantasies that I would have in just a couple of years. She was great too. Then, when I was 9 or so, we got a girl I'll call Kathy. And Kathy was kind of nerdy and younger than our other babysitters, and we liked her, but she was also nice. I think she was more like 14, though. One night, she was going to spend the night at my house, as my parents had some conference out of town, and they were going to spend the night there rather than drive home really late. Kathy had a friend come over, and I don't think she was supposed to, but Jake and I didn't say anything. We were just going to watch TV and eat popcorn and stuff. This was back when all those shows were on Saturday nights, like Fantasy Island and Love Boat and that kind of thing. So anyway, this other teenager I'll call Tina comes over, and they're in the kitchen talking, and we're just watching TV. They come into the room, and Kathy asks if we want to play a game or something. It was still light out, just getting to be dark, and Jake for some reason wanted to play hide and seek, so we all went outside. My neighborhood had a lot of houses, but there was nothing behind us except fields. We had a shed and an old barn in back, but my dad didn't like us playing in the barn as it was kind of run down. So I tell Jake he has to be it first, as he wanted to play, and the rest of us would run and hide. I knew he knew the barn was off limits, and there was this little room off the back that I could hide in, and he never would look there. It was kind of like a storage shed that my dad kept tools and stuff in. I sneaked in and closed the door, which I suppose was totally unfair, and this is where things got creepy. As I'm sitting there on a stool, in comes Tina, and she has her finger up to her lips. I didn't say anything, and we were just waiting there in the dark. This is when she convinced me that we should turn this into a cops and robbers game, and that we can get Jake and Kathy if they get near this back building behind the barn. I say okay, and she says she'll pretend she's the robber and captures me, and I go along with it. I mean, I was just a kid. So she gets some rope and ties my legs together, and then ties my hands behind my back and has me sit on the floor. She went to the door and peeked outside, and then came back over to me as I heard Kathy calling out for us. This girl got down next to me and covered my mouth with her hand and says to be quiet and to wait for them. Again, I'm thinking this is just a game and go along with it. After a minute, she grabbed a roll of black tape and put a piece over my mouth and goes back to the door. Now I'm starting to think this is weird, and I start trying to talk, but obviously can't. She came back over to me and took a plastic bag and put it over my head, and then walked back to the door and went out. I mean, I'm not bullshitting. I'm a little kid tied up on the floor with a bag over my head that's making it hard to breathe. Now I'm freaking out and starting to cry and trying to breathe and get out of the ropes. Tina comes back in and takes the bag off, and she's smiling and laughing and telling me to stop crying. It's just a game. She untied me, and I'm really crying now, and she tells me she'll give me $2 if I stop and not tell anyone. I get it together and promise I won't say anything. Shit, it was $2. Right, stupid kid logic. So we leave and go back to the house where Kathy and Jake are, and they started asking where we were hiding, but I didn't say anything. Later that night, Jake says he's got to pee and goes upstairs. We were watching something on TV, and I didn't notice that Tina went up behind him. Kathy asked if I wanted popcorn, so we went into the kitchen to make it. We got back to the living room, and Tina was just sitting there watching TV, and we joined her. Again, I didn't think about Jake right away. But then I noticed he wasn't around, and I said, "Hey, where'd Jake go?" And Tina said he went to bed. I thought it was odd, but it wasn't for another half hour or so that I got up to see if he was in bed. Tina told me to stay down there and not wake him up, and I thought about earlier in the night and what had happened. I ran upstairs and into our room, and he wasn't there. I looked in our closet and under the beds and then into my parents' room, and he wasn't there either, and he wasn't in the bathroom. Then I thought I heard something in the closet, and I opened the door with Kathy right behind me. Our clothes hamper was in there with a heavy shelf on the lid, and my brother was inside the hamper. Tina had tied him up with my mom's pantyhose and put him in there, put the shelf on the lid so he couldn't get out, and just left. Jake was crying and freaking out, and Kathy did her best to calm him down, and we went back downstairs to yell at Tina, who obviously did this. But she wasn't there. She had left and went home. I told Kathy what had happened to me earlier, and she called Tina's house, but I guess no one answered. Anyway, Kathy stayed with us the rest of the night and didn't let us out of her sight. And we told my parents, and my mom had some choice words for Tina's parents, and also for Kathy for letting that girl even come around. I don't know what happened to that girl, who's now a woman, but I'll never forget that night. I suppose it's not scary to an adult or anyone listening to this, but it was creepy as a kid. I mean, what would have happened if she had stayed later and we fell asleep? I don't even want to think about that. I had nightmares about not being able to breathe for a long time after that. We don't really talk about it, but every once in a while Jake brings her up to me, and I wonder if that fucking psycho woman is out there abusing anybody else. Hey gang, this story isn't as scary as it is tense, and I really like it. It's extremely long, but it was sent in by listener Racer X, and it reminds me a lot of how I was growing up in the suburbs of Buffalo, New York. the way that we used to sneak out when we were really little. And, when you're 12 or 13 or even younger in my case, it was just a lot of fun to run around in neighborhoods and see if you couldn't get caught. And thankfully, I never did. You'll have to wait to hear what happens to Racer X in this one. The Separated Journey, submitted by Racer X. I'm a male in my late 40s, and I'll go by the name Kyle for this story. I have yet to personally experience any paranormal events, but did experience an event in my life that made me feel like experiencing the paranormal might have been a better idea at the time. This event happened when I was around 12. I was living in the suburbs of Dallas, Texas, and was spending the night at a friend's house about 10 miles away from mine, when another friend showed up to crash, so there were 3 of us. My friends, who we will call Jeff and Randy, and I were outside at first, before the sun went down, but our parents didn't like us to be out after dark, and you'll see why later. We were usually causing trouble. Now, to quickly give you a visual of where I was at, the streets had houses on both sides, but the driveways were in back, and to get to them, you had to turn down a 1-lane alley, since most, but not all alleys were a less desirable drive, since that's where trash cans were kept. And if you had a car you were working on, or did not run, or had a crappy 50s camper or whatever, that's where you put it. No one could really see them to complain. Most of the residents had high wooden fences, which is a requirement if you had an in-ground pool, and everybody usually had driveway gates blocking the alley view for safety as well as privacy. Of course, I have to say the alleys were where trouble brewed mostly when the sun went down, since hardly any choir boy walked down them, and there was little to no light. Hiding in the shadows was very easy to do. Then, at the end of these streets was usually a main 3 to 5 lane road that led you to another, and so on and so on. Anyway, all 3 of us would walk the alleys looking to see what the residents threw out and if there was anything worth breaking, like glass, but basically anything that we could get our hands on, and we did so with rock or a pipe or whatever we could find. Back then we had big sewer grates, and smashing beer bottles, light bulbs, that sort of thing into the sewers was pretty fun since it made a loud crashing sound, and if any adult came out, they would not see anything broken, so we were usually in the clear. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh, that's all the entertainment you had, you little shit? Well, no. Actually, we all had BMX bikes and loved to ride or go to certain areas and do bike jumping, as well as skateboarding, because during that time, we didn't have iPods, laptops, cell phones, cable, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and video games. Although home video game systems were worth owning if you played on your TV or were still in its infancy. And at that time, yes, I did have an Atari 2600, but I didn't have a lot of games, and other kids did not have any video games at all. To play video games meant you had to hustle your ass on your BMX to the 7-Eleven 3 blocks away, and for 25 cents play the life-size video games. Fast forward a few hours and it was sometime after 8 p.m., and of course now dark outside. So the 3 of us were playing video games on the TV in Randy's living room. He was the kind of guy who didn't go for the Atari 2600. He had an Intellivision system, so that's what we had, and we took turns since there were 3 of us playing against the winner of the previous game until we got bored. Randy also only had a few games, as well as Randy's mom wanted to go to bed early. She was single and worked a double shift, and she wanted no game noise blaring in her ears since her bedroom was the first room off the living room area. So, we migrated to Randy's room, where he had a smaller black and white TV. And after we all got bored with what shows were on, we moved to something else, which was a game we all played back then called Dungeons & Dragons, or D&D. During that time, we got to talking about our girlfriends, and when we got to mine, who I will call Jessica, I told them that she wanted to hang out at the mall, but I told her I was hanging out with these guys. We would have to do that on the following weekend. Then I made the mistake of telling them that she jokingly asked why don't we all sneak out and come see her and her sister, since her bedroom, which she did share with her older sister, had a nice window that was on the first level, and there would be no climbing. Randy, of course, jumps up and says, "Hell yeah! And, by the way, is her sister good looking?" Then I answered, "I guess, but she's almost 2 years older than us and probably will tell you to piss off." But of course Randy wanted to see for himself, so he looks at me with excitement and asks if I have her number. I told him no, it was on my desk at home. And of course he asked me, "Do you have a good memory, and can't you remember a fucking number?" Since I really didn't feel like sneaking out across town, I said no. I've got a bad memory, matter of fact. What's your name again? He punches me in the shoulder and asks me if I know how to spell her full name. And I did, and I knew part of her number, so he went to his desk and pulled out the white pages. About 20 minutes later, Randy finally stumbled across her name, which kind of surprised me because I figured she wouldn't be in there. But her parents were, and I didn't know her parents' full name. But there was another number listed under her parents' name, which told us apparently the phone number she had given me belonged to her and her sister. So I'm guessing they had their own phone, which, back then, that made you pretty cool. So Randy writes down the number and hands it to me. Of course, I told him I would have to go out in the living room and make the call since there was no phone in his room. But he already had that covered, because he had run out to the living room, yanked the phone out of the wall and came in and plugged it into his phone jack, then handed the receiver to me and told me to get dialing. So after staring at the number for a few seconds, I dialed and prayed no one else would answer, but a soft female voice answered. I hesitated for a minute, and of course my two friends looking at me, motioning me to talk, so I asked if this was Jessica. The female voice on the phone said no, it was her sister, who we will call Amber. But she asked who I was, and I told her it was her boyfriend Kyle, and she told me to hang on a second. Then another voice said, "Hello?" And I told her it was Kyle, and her voice perked up and said, "Hey, what's going on?" and so on. I explained to her why I called. After about 20 minutes on the phone with her, she asked what the heck my friends were doing because she could hear them arguing about D&D rules, and after explaining that, we began talking about the late-night visit to her place. I had only been to her house once, and it was quick and at night when my mother was dropping her off after picking us up from a movie. But I told her I was kind of remembering how to get to her house, and she kind of described the area she was in, and I told her that it couldn't have been that hard to find. Unfortunately, it would take a while because we didn't have bikes to ride, and it would be late, and we couldn't be seen out because of our curfew law, and the fact I didn't want to be shot at sunrise by my parents. She laughed and said she understood, and then proceeded to describe what side of the house she and her sister had the bedroom on, and which way to come in, because there was a small gate, but the lock didn't work and we could go through it easily. I then told her how many of us were going to be there, and how Randy was really interested in her older sister, and she laughed again because she said, "Well, I think she has a boyfriend, but don't tell Randy. Let's see how he acts and makes a bonehead out of himself." I agreed, and after the information was written down, I told her I hoped to see her soon, and please stay up, and then the wishy-washy parts of love you, love you, love you, love you stuff, and then I hung up. After I hung up, Jeff and Randy immediately stopped debating on the D&D rules and looked at me and said, "Well?" I told him I have the information we needed, and of course Randy yanked it out of my hand, started reading it, and said that he knew where this place was, and that we shouldn't have a problem getting there. It would just be hard trying to do it incognito, considering we're not allowed to be seen out in public because it'll be around midnight. But he was excited, and so was Jeff, and I decided to throw some bullshit in about Jessica's sister might like him or something, and his eyes got wide, and he told everybody in the room to start grabbing stuff and getting ready. I asked him, what stuff? We're going to someone's house, not on a fucking diamond heist. He gave me a smirk and said, "No, but we're going to need flashlights." And I said, "Well, unfortunately mine's at home." And then I looked at Jeff, and he looked back and kind of laughed and said his was at the same place. My home, and Randy said I got a couple extras and went out of his room for a minute, but came back with only 2. Fast forward, and now it's 12:30. Randy came back into his bedroom and said his mom was out like a light, and we were leaving in 5 minutes. 5 minutes came pretty damn quick, of course, and we started exiting his home through the side window out of his bedroom very carefully, since anybody who would be out and about walking or sitting on their porch smoking cigarettes or whatever, they would see us. But we were lucky, no one did, and we ventured on to my girlfriend's house. Now, the trip out was not super exciting or adventurous or scary, but the trip back was different. As we walked down an alley that was of course dark, we felt invincible because of course there were 3 of us, and that there wasn't a lot of hiding until we got closer to Jessica's place. I kind of laughed because part of the area we walked through was very familiar to me because it wasn't too far from my place. I was nervous though because I didn't want my father to be driving home late at night and pulling up next to me and saying, "Hi son, what the fuck are you doing out here in this dark dangerous alley we've told you not to be in after dark?" Get your ass in the car. It's time to die. Still, we ventured on. About 100 yards from Jessica's place was where we ran into a little bit of a problem. We were coming down an alley and had to cut between two duplexes, which brought us out onto a side street, and across the street was an apartment complex. We were supposed to turn left and walk down the street, cross a 5-lane intersection, and then go down to another street. The problem was we could do that simply during the day, but at night, once again, we were not allowed to be seen, so the three of us were hiding behind parked vehicles. That's when Randy and Jeff decided to make a mad dash across the street and hide in some bushes that just happened to be next to a place's bedroom window. I stopped on the sidewalk and stared at them and said, "What the fuck are you doing? You're gonna get us caught." As the two of them were pushing each other. Then I heard something about one standing on somebody's foot or something, so I made a dash back to the cars and hid behind them for a few minutes, because I could have swore I heard voices coming up from the complex. I wasn't sure since it was very dark, and being young and out in the dark with voices traveling and playing tricks in your head, I just couldn't tell or know where anything was. But I was not going to get caught with these two yo-yos hiding in the bushes. I peeked over the vehicles I was hiding behind, and I could still see them on the bushes. A little bit, but then all of a sudden, two of them made another mad dash out of the bushes, and without looking across the 5 lanes of traffic to the other side. And that's when they disappeared in the dark behind the first house on the corner. I stood up and just stared in that direction, wondering what the hell just happened. Hey guys, don't you remember me? So I ran down the opposite side of the street. But of course, I was now in the yards of the homes, and I had to hide behind a brick retaining wall looking for them, because cars were now driving on the main road, which kept me from crossing. Freaking out, I'm yelling across the street with a raspy voice like you see in the movies, when someone is sneaking up on someone else and doesn't want anybody to hear them, but you know damn well they do. I'm yelling out their names, and "Where the hell are you?" And of course, I get no response. So after waiting for cars to go by, I hop the brick retaining wall and make a run across the main streets to the house that they ran behind, and come out on the other side and start scanning around, looking for them. But of course, I can't see shit. And here comes a car. Then I had to dive behind some trash cans, hoping no one saw me. Now I'm really ticked off, and I'm thinking I can probably just find my girlfriend's place without them, but when I start going down the street, it doesn't look familiar to me, and I'm starting to freak out even more now because I'm not sure where the house is. And again, Randy had the directions, as he was going to be the leader. Now he's gone, so I have no way of knowing. Foolishly, I yell out with the raspy voice again for Randy and Jeff, and of course, no response. Now I'm fuming because I can't find them, and another car is coming down the street, so in my head, I say, fuck it, I'm going back to Randy's. Because, yeah, I could have gone back home, but it would have been very hard to explain to my parents why I was sleeping in the backyard. Also, I would have been killed for being out that late and walking alone down these alleys and so forth. So now the real adventure begins, because upon making a backtrack across the main road over the retaining wall and then between the duplexes in the alley, I can hear people talking in the direction I needed to go. So I have to go down another alley that I'm not 100% sure of, which leads me to a road, and then after dodging any cars, I manage to get down another alley. But this one is twice as dark because someone has smashed out the corner light, and now I'm worried about being kidnapped, which has actually happened to people before. I'm trying to walk down the center of the alley until, lo and behold, another vehicle turns in, and I have to dive into a pile of trash bags to my right. After the car drives slowly by and turns into a driveway, I get up and start hauling ass down the alley until I get where the alley comes to a road. Then I can hear more people talking, but luckily it was behind the fence in their backyard. So I start walking by, and then I hear someone say, "Hey, you! What the hell are you doing on the other side of that fence, punk? Come here!" Now, instead of freezing, I just ran and ran fast down the rest of the alleyway to the left. And then I realized that I'm 4 blocks short of where we came in. And the only way to get across the next main road is going through a football field that had a track circling it on the outside to make it even more tricky. The only thing that was around both of those was a see-through chain-link fence, so hiding behind that was out of the question. First I have to lose the 2 or 3 or hell, I didn't even remember to count, people that saw me through their fence and were now making their way after me because I can hear them still yelling. So I turn into a driveway that happens to have a small boat with a tarp that wasn't fully covering it. I made damn sure it was when I hid in it. So now I'm lying in this boat, and I hear people, which seem to be 3 of them, probably their late teens or early 20s, milling around. They were saying things like, "Whoever that was could be anywhere," and "I'm not running any further," and "Did you see that little motherfucker sprint when we came around the corner?" And then one of them says, "Let's go back to the beers," but I still waited another 10 minutes before I exited the boat. Kneeling behind the trash cans in the same driveway where the boat was, I'm scanning across the football field and track that this house backed up to, trying to figure out how I'm going to get across it without any of the cars on the main road seeing me, because now I'm guessing Randy and Jeff are probably making their way back home too. If they got there before me and notice I'm not there, then one of them I'm sure will want to tell his mother or call the police or some bullshit, and again I'll be killed by my parents. So I run and hop the fence and make it across the field towards another chain link fence, and I think I'm doing pretty good, considering I'm almost there. But then, of course, cars come, and I dive face first to the ground. This time I'm convinced they must have seen me. But none of the cars slowed down, and they moved on, and I got up, hopped the fence, and got across the street and behind a vehicle parked in the corner house driveway. Then I heard a truck go by, and that's when I felt it was time to have a heart attack. After sitting behind the vehicle in the driveway for about another 10 minutes trying to catch my breath, I sneaked out upon the sidewalk to take a look up the street and realized that it's a straight shot. But the problem is, any car that comes down in either direction can see anybody and everybody. So this means I have to walk along all the houses and behind the houses and part of the alley to the right. So I start walking down the sidewalk foolishly because I'm pissed off to the max right now, and I'm going to whoop some serious ass when I get a hold of Randy and Jeff. I figure I can take on anybody now because I'm not even scared of my parents, until a car turns onto the main street, and of course I run for cover up in somebody's driveway. There's no vehicles to hide behind, but they had a brick inlay or post-like design where I was able to stand in the shadows and suck in my gut, which was really not much of a gut. But first I start walking in the yards of the homes facing the main road, because this section doesn't have an alleyway, and I'm going to have to go up another direction that we did not come down. After doing this in and out thing with people's yards, I start getting closer to the last main road to cross, when I hear a dog start barking. Suddenly, a porch light comes on, and now I'm running twice as fast until I crack my ankle on something made of cement or iron or steel or whatever, but I didn't see it because it was dark in that section of the yard. It turned out to be one of those little yard gnomes, and I have to kneel down behind the neighbor's porch that was next to the dog and light that just came on. In pain, I'm holding my ankle and watching as some guy comes out on his porch looking around, and then telling his dog to shut the hell up. There's no one out here. But he still decides to walk out a little further and look in my direction. Now you have to understand, I'm thinking, what the hell is this guy doing? Because it's got to be at least 1:30 or 2 in the morning. But I'm 12, and not really ever staying up that late. I guess I didn't understand that some people were night owls. After finally getting some relief in my ankle, the guy ends up walking back into the house and slamming the door. Then, of course, I panic again, because I figured now that he slammed the door and yelled at his dog, somebody else will come out to see what's going on. I start to run again with a limp until I get to an area where I can cut between 2 houses and get down the alleyway that's to the left. I feel somewhat safer because there's not a lot of lights, but of course that changes when I start hearing things, and of course not seeing them. My heart's now racing as I race to the main road for the last time. After clearing the main road, I realize where I'm at, and it's my friend's house. It's just about 2 blocks ahead of me, except now I see someone jogging and have to take cover behind some more trash cans. And this is a corner house, and they will be coming along the main road, so once again, I wait and don't breathe. The jogger goes by and I make a beeline down the alley until I hear a car start and reverse lights come on. Now I have to backtrack and find a place to hide, which ends up being somebody's big driveway who has another dog. I run across the driveway to another driveway and hide behind a camper trailer. I'm thinking to myself, this is such bullshit. I'm going to get my ass wrung out by my parents, and then I'm probably going to go to prison because I'm going to kill 2 people named Randy and Jeff when I get back to the house, if I ever even get back there. The car backs up and out into an alley and slowly drives away. Except this time I don't have any patience, so I come out into the alley along the fence line, because the shadow of the area where I'm supposedly hidden from view, it seems like a good place to be, but the damn car stops. And I freeze for a second, and then panic when I see the reverse lights come on again. And this time I run back to the camper I was hiding at and notice their gate is open, leading to the front of the house. I run through that, ending up in their front yard and running around that to the left. Now I'm down 2 houses and notice there's no fencing to the left, so I cut between the houses and hide behind another car in another driveway, trying to figure out why the car stopped and started going in reverse. I can see the shining headlights, but no car, and I inch my way down to the parked cars in the driveway and realize I guess the dumbass forgot something or he wanted to throw something away, because they had the car door open, and I heard him saying something to somebody else. And then I heard the sound of trash getting thrown into a trash can, followed by the door closing on the car, it going into gear and causing me to fall backwards and then crawl beside the crawl back beside the vehicle closest to the garage. While hiding, I noticed the car drive by slowly and disappear out of view because of the fencing to my right, and that's the only way you can go. So I wait for the car to disappear out of sight, take the alley and cut between the 2 houses and come out into a cul-de-sac, and just 2 houses down is my friend's place. I see the window is still partially open and tear ass after it. When I get to the window, I kneel down beside it and look around behind me and see that no one else is there, so I slide open the window and crawl through, almost taking out the shades as one caught my shoe. Luckily, I caught it with my hand and causing that loud issue to not actually happen. Then I slowly close the window, leaving a crack, and I turn and look, but Randy and Jeff are nowhere to be found. I kick off my shoes and lay on my sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling, telling myself, okay, I can die now peacefully. But then I start to worry, because knowing Randy and Jeff are still out there, what if they get caught? And then my successful adventure that nearly gave me 2 strokes and 4 heart attacks and wet pants would have all been for nothing. So I just laid there and waited. Fast forward about an hour, and I'm just starting to doze off because I've now gotten somewhat calm, when I hear the window slide open and see a figure start crawling through. It was Randy. After he enters, he holds the blinds for Jeff to not unhook them, and they both close the window and turn to me now because I'm sitting up ready to kill. Randy first speaks and says, "Holy shit, you got back here before us? I'll be damned." But before he could continue, I said to them in the raspy, quiet voice but filled with anger, "What the fuck was the matter with you two?" Jeff looks at me with confusion, and I remind him that this was supposed to be a group effort, but leaving me behind was pretty fucking stupid. That's when Randy said that they took off because they thought when I turned around and went behind the cars that I was just going to go home. I said, "No, asshole. I turned around and went back to the cars because you dumbasses were making too much noise hiding in the bushes next to somebody's bedroom window." Jeff spoke up and said, "Well, that's because this asshole was standing on my hand and then accidentally elbowed me in the face when he was trying to slide down into the bushes next to the window." I was still bent, but I couldn't help laughing a little bit, picturing these 2 stooges doing what they had just described. Then Randy was going to say something, but I put my hand up and said, "I don't want to hear any more of your bullshit. But instead, tell me, did you see my girl and her sister?" Randy and Jeff both said no, and then Jeff said something about when they went to tap on a window where Jessica told them to go, it was dark, and when they did tap, no one came. They sat there for about 30 or 45 minutes, and then decided that they should tap on another window. But then they had to hide because a neighbor came out with a dog that had to take a whiz, and then after a few more taps to the dark window, they gave up and headed back. I told them I was surprised they hadn't gotten caught because of the way they handled things, but they said they only had to hide a few times and asked about my adventure, which I told them the next day over breakfast. The next day my mother picked me up from Randy's, and I called Jessica and let her know what had happened. I explained the adventures we all had, and she laughed, and she said that she was sorry, but she and her sister were not in their room because they were watching movies, and they fell asleep in the living room. She said she thought it was cute that we actually went through with everything, and I told her I didn't think so, but I was glad to talk to her, and I would be happy to see her at school Monday morning. I followed by saying I had to go because I had to color the gray out of my hair and kill my 2 friends. She laughed again and told me that she thought I was silly. Many years later, I believe in my late 20s or early 30s, I took a drive down to my old neighborhood in Dallas, since I lived in Missouri at that time. I drove down all the alleys, even the one by my house, and I realized how small they were, even though they looked like they were so big at the age of 12. When I stopped my car to look around some more, it was at night, and I made damn sure to lock all my doors. Then I started laughing, because here I was, worried about getting shot, carjacked, or whatever, thinking back when I was 12 years old and there was no protection such as locked car doors, handguns, tasers, or any weapon of the sort. Back then, the only thing I was worried about was getting caught and having to face my parents. Backwoods Scumbags, submitted by Officer John. This took place in 2006. It was my 10th year as a Leo. I'm not saying exactly where this happened, and you can call me John, as what I'm sharing with you and your listeners can't be linked back to me. Leos see and deal with all kinds of shit that most people would not know what to do with, and none of us are perfect. There's so much going wrong in the world today, and we all have a microscope pointed at us that it's hard to even write this. I want to say this from the get-go. You may not like the police, you may have had a bad run-in with some, but please hold your judgment of me and my story until it's finished. I work in a fairly remote area of Nebraska. In fact, there are only 10 full-time Leos in our county outside of our chief, and let me tell you, our days are long and sometimes boring, but they can also be intense, and stuff happens that burn memories into your soul. One afternoon, I was midway through a double. That's 20 hours straight with 4 overtime hours, one of the only perks we get through our union. I was lucky enough to be close to home and was having an early supper with my wife and kids before heading back out. Again, another perk. It's great to be able to see your family for a bit in the middle of your workday. Lots of people don't have that. I'll never forget, we were having spaghetti that my wife made, and I was happy because a hot meal on a cold afternoon and night hit the spot. It was early November when this happened. As I kissed my wife and bounced my son up and down on my knee, I went 10-8 and headed out into the cold. Not long after I drove away from my house, the radio picked up, and I heard it.
All units 1059, 911 dispatch is advising current 1034 at 2438 J Road. Ambulance is en route for suspected firearm discharge.
That wasn't too far from me, and I knew I'd likely be the first person there. I had a suspicion of what was going on. We all knew that address well and who lived there. 34 in, 10-4, will advise upon arrival. Is this who I think it is? I said back.
Copy 34, yes it is. 911 is still connected with caller.
Great. Just fucking great. We all know who this family was, and we all hated going out there. My colleagues and I always keep things clean and never shirk on our duties, but this was the Smith family. Again, not their name, and I hate to admit I feel this way, but they were some of the most disgusting backwoods, middle-of-nowhere trolls anywhere in the United States. 12 of them living under one roof, welfare, a lot of teeth broken off at the gum line, just a sad, sad picture of America gone wrong. The father, Bill, hadn't worked a day in his life, and his wife, Belinda, was just a baby maker, and neither of them gave a shit about their kids or the quote-unquote house they lived in. They basically lived one step up from squalor, and like I said, we hated going out there. The only constant out there was trouble, booze, and calls to us. Sometime in the late 90s, they had gotten permission to get foster kids, and that's where I think most of the kids came from. Just another way to get money from the state and not have to do anything for it. The kids ranged from 22 all the way down to 7, and they were all crammed into a 3-bedroom farmhouse out in the middle of nowhere. No running water. It was just gross. So here I am, heading out to what I'm sure is a booze-fueled argument with one of them shooting off a firearm, when I see a figure running towards me on the road. It was a young girl, and she had blood on her pants and shirt. I knew right away she was one of the Smith clan. Radio 34 in, 1079, I said into my radio, asking to go to our emergency channel.
Go ahead, 34,
she said after we flipped. I have a young female running towards me that looks severely injured on J Road about a mile from the Smith residence in the 1034 call. Please advise.
Copy 34, Sergeant advises you to handle this situation. Units en route to disturbance call.
I pull over and immediately notice this young woman, maybe 12 or 13, and she has no shoes on and has a look of horror on her face. Blood has smeared her cheeks, and all I could think of was that last scene in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre with the young woman running for her life. Radio, 1055 to location on J Road if possible. 1020 less than 1 mile from 2348 J Road. Female in distress. Leaving vehicle to assess.
10-434, ambulance to your location. Should be there in minutes.
I get out of my Crown Vic, and the young woman ran straight to me, and I blocked her with my door. She was crying and screaming, and I asked her if she was shot or stabbed and where. I quickly pulled gloves on and told her that it was going to be okay, but I needed to know where she was hurt. And this is where it gets messed up. The little girl stops screaming and just stares at me for a minute. Then she bursts into tears and crumples to the ground. I move around my door and ask her again where she's hurt. And then I notice two things: a tear in her pants on her left thigh, a faint smear of blood on her khaki pants near her crotch, and blood on her face. She's blubbering and trying to talk to me, and I reach out for her arm and tell her that it's going to be okay. She was obviously cut or shot, as the tear in her thigh was reflective of something that grazed her and caused some decent bleeding, but it wasn't anything more than a fairly good slash. The girl then just started saying, "He did this. He did this. It's not my fault. It's not my fault." I told her it wasn't her fault, and then I could hear the ambulance roaring down the road behind me. I again checked her bleeding, and it was more gory than anything that was putting her in danger. But she was in light clothing in the freezing air, so I helped her up as the paramedics pulled up and jumped into action. 2 other cars drove around us on the way to the Smith farm, and I gave the EMS guys a bit of information that I had, and they got her inside and did their thing. I got back in my cruiser and radioed I was on my way up J Road. When I got there, 2 of my colleagues were already out of their vehicles, and from the chatter that I heard on the radio, 911 was still on the line, but no one was there anymore, talking back to them. Luke approached the door and banged on it, yelling out that we were there. "Sheriff's deputies, open the door." Nothing happens, but we can see people moving around inside and taking their good old time coming to the door. Pete and I head around the opposite sides of the house looking into the windows, but can't see anything through the shit caked all over them. Luke yells for us to come back to the front, and the door is now open. Mr. Smith is standing there looking like the white trash POS he is, and asks us what's all the fuss. Pete tells him about the 911 call, and in the excitement, I yell out about the little girl I just saw. The slob lets us in, and we ask for whomever is still on the 911 call. But Smith and his wife, who has now emerged from a back room stinking of BO, booze, and feces, says we're wrong and have no reason to be there. There is no one on 911. 2 more cars pull up. One is our sergeant, and he's not taking any bullshit from these people. He tells them they either play it straight or everyone's going to jail. Everything goes quiet. Then we can hear a muffled sound, and over the radio we're informed the call is still active, but again, no one is responding to the 911 dispatcher. "Where is the phone?" asks my sergeant. The 2 morons just look at one another, and Sarge points a finger at them and barks out, "I want everyone in this farm accounted for right this second." Belinda lights up a cigarette. Sarge tells her to put it out, and Luke and Pete go outside to look around for the other kids. As I move towards the door Mrs. Smith came out of. The smell was awful as I walked down the hall, with the Smiths yelling at me that I had no right to be going there. Sarge held them at bay, telling them we were on a distress call and I did have the right to be there. I open a door, and there are like 5 kids sitting on the floor playing some sort of board game, and they all look up at me scared. I gently ask if they are all right, and I get a lot of nods and vacant stares. A little boy asks if he was in trouble, and I said, "Why would you be in trouble?" "Mama says we'll be in trouble if you ask us anything." I shook my head no, and then asked if anyone had made a phone call to the police. Another little girl, the youngest I guessed, pointed to the wall, and I figured she meant the next room over. I smiled at her and backed out of the room and listened for the muffled sound. That's when I heard sobbing coming from a closet that had the door closed and a screwdriver wedged into a bar, keeping it shut. I cautiously opened the door after pulling out the screwdriver and shined my maglite into the face of a boy about 12 years old. He was crying and had a huge welt on his face that I knew would be bruising up in no time. "Come on out of there, partner. It's okay," I said. I heard a shriek from the fat woman and more yelling from Mr. Smith. "Did you call 911? The boy nodded, looking down. "Where's the phone?" I asked. He motioned to the other bedroom, and I asked him to show me. Suddenly, Mrs. Smith is right behind me screaming that I can't talk to her kid without her being there, and I shut the door and held it closed with my foot as the kid scrambled underneath what was supposed to be a bed, but was nothing more than a piece of plywood on some cinder blocks. He reached under it and handed me a cell phone that was still open, with dispatch still on the line. They knew we were on the scene, but had stayed on the line just in case. Mrs. Smith is going completely apeshit now, and a female sheriff, let's call her Trudy, has arrived and is handling her. "Is this your parents' phone?" I asked the little boy. He shook his head. I thought it odd that something like this would be out here at this shitbox. "Whose phone is it, my man?" "Maddie's," he said, barely above a whisper. It then dawned on me. Maddie. The only one of the older kids that was worth a shit. He was the only one who went to school and graduated, and he must have been about 19 by now. I knew he worked at the supermarket in town, and I know he wanted to go to community college, but he gave a lot of his money to his family because he knew his foster parents didn't take care of his brothers and sisters. "Does Maddie still live here? Where is he? Does he know you have his phone?" The boy nodded and told me that Maddie didn't live there anymore. He had a place with his girlfriend and was at work right now. He had been out there earlier and let his brother have the phone to play some games and was going to come back for it later that night. I asked him what happened, and through crying, he told me a fucked up story of what had happened. Before Maddie had left, he had heard words with Toby, a 16-year-old living there, about him being odd to his sister. It turns out that was the one I found on the road. The little guy couldn't say what was going on because he didn't understand it, but after Maddie left, Toby had taken his sister to the barn out back, and she had come back screaming out and bloodied in a bad way. This little guy said he wanted to call Maddie, but it kicked in that he had Maddie's phone, so he did the only thing he knew to do, and that was tell his father, Bill. Apparently Bill had told him to shut up, and that he didn't want cops around, and that's when the girl burst into the house with her clothes torn, screaming, and she was bleeding. Toby came in after her and chased her out the front door with a rifle, and took a shot at her, grazing her leg. The kid grabbed the phone to try to call 911, and Belinda tried to stop him. He ran and hid the phone before both Bill and Belinda beat him and locked him in the closet. We accounted for all the kids, and CPS came out and took them all away, and the search for Toby was on. It didn't take long. We found the asshole just a few miles away on a road, kind of wandering around. So the full story is the worst. Toby was trying to get his sister to have sex, and when she wouldn't, he started hitting her, and that's when she got her first period, and barely understood what was happening to her biologically, let alone this physical beating. I'll never forget that poor little girl screaming to me that it wasn't her fault. That's the kind of thing that stays with you. The kids went into different foster care, and 2 older ones who weren't there at the time moved away. The state pressed Bill and Belinda with a bunch of abuse, negligence, and obstruction charges, you name it. They both got time and are still serving sentences. Toby got out of Junior Disneyland Hotel, this sick little shit. But I heard he's back in jail for something else, but it didn't happen around here, so I'm not really sure what it was. I still see Maddie once in a while, and I was always told by people in court that he hadn't forgiven himself for not being there for his sister and family, and that he still beats himself up about not taking care of them. I did run into him at a softball game one night, and I pulled him aside and told him that he had done enough, and that he and his little brother had saved their sister. If he hadn't have let that little kid play with his phone that night, the 911 call never would have been made, and things could have been a lot worse. Please don't take this as a story about blasting foster care. Foster care is a great thing, but there are some sick people out there, and it makes me angry that the system misses them from time to time. I've got lots more stories. I know this was super long, and I'm sure your peeps are ready for your next story, but I hope you read this. Take care. The Phone Bill by Turicue. About 15 years or so ago, I moved across the country for a job. When I left, it was pretty much a case of leaping for the brass ring. The dot-com crash had wiped out all the tech jobs in the area I was in, and after a year and a half of practical unemployment and crushing poverty, I gave up on ever finding a decent job where I lived. Leaping for the brass ring, or maybe leaping out of the window of a burning building, either way, it was a blind jump into the unknown. I accepted a job offer at a place in the middle of nowhere, packed what I could, and gave everything else away. Picture the scene. You're a young kid, giving up everything you know and everyone around you just for the chance at making a living. You've got maybe a couple of $100 to your name, everything you own is stacked in the back of your car, and you're driving off into the sunset. There's not much keeping you above the ground. A breakdown that takes more money than you have to get fixed, any kind of medical issue, any kind of rough wave could upset your unsteady boat, and then you're lost in the middle of nowhere with no friends to help you. The stress is almost unimaginable if you haven't gone through something like that. I made it to where the job was and found a place to live, a nasty, cheap apartment next to a liquor store and a bar that seemed to have police cars pulling in and flashing lights almost all night long. The people upstairs screamed at each other in broken English all throughout the day. Meth heads panhandled a lot whenever the cops weren't around, and the only way I could get any sleep in all of that was a combination of sleeping pills and hard liquor, the cheapest I could get. Pro tip number 1, the Colonel's Pride bourbon was like $6 for a fifth. Pro tip number 2, this is a bad idea. At some point early in the morning on one of those first days on the job, my phone rang, waking me up. You know how you are when you're bleary with broken sleep, booze, and pills? I mean, everything just seems unreal. And this was back before smartphones were big, and the cell phones you could get were expensive. I had a crappy landline with a $10 phone plugged into the wall. There was no clock on it, and I didn't know what time it was. And that it was still dark, and that no one calls at that level of darkness unless someone's dying or dead. I answered the phone still half drunk. Some part of me knew my parents had died. How could you know something like that? And the person on the phone was my parents' next-door neighbor, who must have been pushing 90. I'd cut her grass once a week when I was a kid. Adding to the unreality of the moment was that she'd been diagnosed with Alzheimer's nearly a decade before. The last time I had seen her, so little of her mind had been left that she probably wouldn't have been able to hold a telephone handset unassisted. "Johnny?" she said. "Remember how I said I mowed her lawn as a kid? I must have been the only person she ever saw for that last decade of her life that she knew. Every Saturday I'd come by with the lawnmower, watching her slow decline into mindlessness as she waved to me more and more feebly. She didn't have any family as far as anyone could tell, only an endless stream of nurses feeding her and taking care of her. I was probably the only person whose name she still remembered at the end. Looking back now, that must have been why she called me, of all people. "Hello, Mrs. So-and-so. What's wrong?" I knew the next words that were going to come out of her mouth. Car crash, house fire, some kind of tragedy. "I'm so cold," she said. I think there are... "What?" I asked. I was fighting through the pills and booze in panic and could barely hold on to the phone. "Worms," she said. "I think there are worms crawling on me." I couldn't answer. I literally didn't know what to say. But then she hung up and the phone went to that beep, 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 beep sound you only get when you've had the phone off the hook for too long without ever dialing. Fuck, maybe I had hallucinated the whole thing. Everything was a fog and a dark haze. And I hung up the phone, and I remembered hearing an ambulance siren off in the distance. I didn't call my parents right away. I didn't want to panic them with a phone call in the middle of the night over what was probably just a bad dream or a hallucination or a night terror of some kind. Instead, I spent 3 hours drifting in and out of my days, staring out the window at the lights of the bar, and watching the police cars drift in and out of the darkness like ghosts. When the sun finally came up, I knew that my parents must have been finally awake. When the sun finally came up, I knew that my parents would be awake, so I called them. My mom answered the phone. I tried as hard as I could to sound as normal as possible, but she's my mom and immediately knew something was wrong. "Is Mrs. So-and-so okay?" I finally asked. "Honey, she died last Wednesday," my mom said. "We didn't want to tell you until you were settled in, but she faded out almost the day you left, and the funeral was just yesterday." In a way, it was a relief. I mean, ghosts don't make phone calls. Casper shouldn't have to rely on Ma Bell. It must have been a bad dream with coincidental timing, or more likely some deep part of my subconscious had detected Mrs. So-and-so, slowly failing and wasting away. And maybe I kept it hidden, and it only came out later like a skull being washed clean from a grave after a flood. When my phone bill came in almost a month later, I had almost forgotten the whole thing. The money actually seemed like a waste of time. I hadn't used the phone at all, other than to call my parents and to be terrorized by it that night. Also, other terrible things had swamped it out of my memory. I'd seen a guy get gunned down in the parking lot of the bar across the street, and I almost lost my job, the one thing that was making all of this worthwhile, over someone else's stupid mistake. Thank God at the last moment the truth came out and I was spared. I mean, the horrors of the real world had completely washed out the terrors of that night. I remember sitting at the cheap peeling for mica table in the corner of my apartment that was my combination desk and kitchen table. I was just staring at the bill. $48 for a telephone that I had only used twice to call my parents, and that no one had ever even called me. But the bill said otherwise. One incoming call was listed. Without even thinking, I threw the bill away without looking at the number. I didn't want to know. "I think there are worms crawling on me," she had said. I canceled the phone the next day and bought a cell phone I couldn't afford. I'm sure it was nothing, maybe a wrong number, maybe a telemarketer, fuck, who knows. All I know is, we can choose what we want to believe, and I choose to believe that that call in the night was nothing more than just a nightmare. It's easier that way. Crazy Drunk, submitted by TomTom41. When I was in college, there was a strip of bars that everyone went to, and there were plenty to choose from. There were old man bars, nightclub dance places, live music places, and then those ones off the beaten path that were really only full of townies. For some reason, my friends and I liked to hit those up once in a while. They were quieter, and you could get a game of pool or darts in without having to wait for a row of quarters ahead of you. When we first started going to this one place, I'll call it Aces because it's still open and I don't want to use their real name, the townies were unsure of us. I mean, we were just punk kids from the school. But when they realized we were just going to hang out, drink beer, shoot pool, they got to like us. Except this one guy. I'll call him Steve. He used to complain to the bartenders and owners that we shouldn't be there, but we tipped very well, and they didn't care. Shit, we caused less problems than a lot of the townies. At any rate, we were hanging out one Saturday night watching a hockey game before we went downtown to hook up with some other friends and find some women. It was me, let's call me Tom, my friends Scott, and Mike, who we called Big Mike. We're still all good friends, and Mike is still a big, big dude. 6'4", 220, built like a brick shithouse. We're all just hanging out and drinking and playing pool and darts with the locals. I should call them locals. They were cool, not like a lot of the townies who hated us students and always started shit. And we were laughing and betting on the game with stupid bets like who would score next in the hockey game and stuff like that. Then in comes Steve. Everyone could see that he was already pretty well in the bag. So he sits on a bar stool and asks for a beer, and then just starts staring at the screen, not saying anything. The bartender tries talking to him, and he doesn't say anything back. We keep playing and laughing and having a good time, and then Scott pipes up and says, "All right, boys, one more game of cricket, and we should vamoose." Suddenly, Steve spins on his stool and says, "What the fuck is that? What the fuck is vamoose?" Everyone just kind of looks at each other like, what the fuck? And he says it again. "What the fuck is vamoose? Is that some wetback shit talk?" I should say that the college I went to was not super rural, but it wasn't near a big city either. The town over did have a large Hispanic population, though, and I could sense there was some tension with this guy. So as we're just standing there, the bartender leans over and says, "Take it easy, Steve, it's just an expression," and gets him another beer. He keeps looking at us for another minute, and then turns around. We're all like, what the fuck? I put some quarters in to play cricket. It was me and Scott versus two of the locals. I'll call them Paul and Jerry. Mike and Tom play a game of 9-ball and finish before we beat our friends by one bullseye and some points. Jerry laughingly yells out, "That's some serious bullshit right there," and we all shake hands, and then I fall forward as Steve has jumped up and pushed me in the back. Jerry and Paul grab me and say, "What the fuck was that?" By now, the bartender and two other guys are grabbing Steve and telling him to cut the shit, but he's not calming down. Finally he does, and everyone is just looking at him. And as drunk as he was, he quickly grabbed a bottle and chucked it right at us, and nearly hit Scott in the face before it smashed into the dart machine. Everybody jumped into action as Steve ran at us. Big Mike jumped in front of him, and the guy takes a swing, and Mike just turns and the punch hits his arm. Mike grabs the guy by the throat while two locals grab Steve, and the bartender is yelling out for everyone to just relax. He runs around the bar, and Mike lets the guy go. Long story short, Steve gets booted and told if he ever comes back, they're calling the cops. He's forced out the door and the bartender asks if everyone is okay. We're all amped up and just babbling away the way that you do when you're full of adrenaline. The bartender yells out, okay, shots on the house for everyone. We all start laughing and salute to each other. Shaking hands with everyone, the three of us say we'll see everybody around and head out to the next place. Everything in this town is within walking distance, but Ace's was about a mile or so from the main strip. As we're walking, I get an uneasy feeling and keep looking behind us as we walk through a neighborhood on the sidewalk. Scott notices and asks, "What's up?" "Nothing," I say. "I just got a weird vibe going on, man." We got to the next place, and it was about 11 o'clock, so people were really starting to show up in large numbers, and we're having a good time with our friends. And we do find some ladies. I talked with this super cute girl that was on the swim team at our school. At the end of the night, I offered to walk her home. Yeah, I know, sly fox move, right? She says she's going to her friend's house, but we exchanged numbers, and she says she wants to get together tomorrow. I ended up dating her for 5 years before we broke up. We're still friends. Awesome woman, but I digress. So now there's 5 of us, as Mark and Hank are joining the 3 of us for one last wobbly pop before we head back to our apartment complex. We're all a little stewed, and maybe that's why we didn't notice what was going on as we walked down the main street back home. We were being followed by 4 guys. As the downtown part ended and we got into neighborhoods, Big Mike says he needs to take a leak and runs behind a bush in front of a house. We all stop to wait for him when suddenly we hear him yell out. I turn and see the 4 guys we didn't know were there behind us, behind Mike, and what happened was Steve had rounded up some of his buddies and followed us around all night. Steve had smashed the back of Mike's knees with a piece of rebar. The other guy started to hit him when he buckled. We all jumped over the bushes and just blasted into these guys. I'm only 5'11" and about 180 pounds, and some of these guys were way bigger, but I didn't care. Again, I'm sure beer had something to do with it. Everyone kind of picks a guy, and I slam into Steve, and he drops the piece of rebar. I scramble to pick it up and just started beating him with it. He's on his chest with his hands on his head, and I'm wailing away on his back like a maniac. He's yelling, "Stop! Stop!" And I'm fucking crazy now, and I'm yelling all this macho bullshit back at him. And every time I smash him, I'm saying, "Stop! How about now, motherfucker?" Next thing I know, I've got stars in my head, as one of the other guys had knocked down Hank and punched me in the side of the head. Everything was in slow motion, and I see Scott and Mark kicking a guy on the ground. Big Mike is going to town on another townie, and this other dude throwing me another punch to the gut. Steve is on the ground all fucked up, and the guy with me flicks out a knife and swings at me, and in my haze, I stumble backwards over Steve, and the guy just grazes my head right above my temple. I fall back and can feel something warm on my face, and blood flows into my eye. By now, the lights from the house we're at have come on, and everyone kind of stops. Steve and his buddies kind of get up and start running off, and Big Mike grabs me and tells me we have to go. A guy comes out on the porch and says he's called the cops, and now I know we really need to go. We start running, but like a shithead, all that does is make the blood pour out of my head cut faster, so I take my flannel shirt off and wrap a sleeve around it. We finally get back to our apartment complex, and Scott is freaking out about getting me to a hospital, but Mark, who was studying to be a personal trainer, looked at it and said it wasn't that bad and wouldn't need stitches. He cleaned it up, and I looked at everyone. Scott's got a swollen eye, Hank has dried blood on his nose, and the only 2 guys unscathed are Big Mike and Mark. We've started coming down from the adrenaline rush, and Mike has thrown us all a beer, and I've got a massive headache starting up. That's when the front window of our place cracked. Someone had thrown something at it. Mike and Mark ran to the door and opened it to look out into the parking lot. And it was quiet, and lit only by a couple of street lamps with that orangish glow. Then, another rock came whizzing by and hit the door right next to them. 3 of the guys, including Steve, were at the edge of the lot and throwing shit at our place. Hank, Mike, and Mark run out at them, and I call the cops. I mean, enough was enough. I watched them fighting from our stoop and told the police what was going on. Steve saw me and made a run for me, but he tripped on a parking block and cannoned into a car and smashed his face on a headlight. Honestly, I started laughing. But then I stopped when I saw him pull a gun from his pocket. I yelled to my guys that there was a gun, and that's when this drunk shithead started pulling the trigger. By now the lights are turning on in all of the apartments, and people are at their windows and doors or coming outside wondering what the fuck is going on. The police can hear what's going on and are asking me what I can tell them, and that's when Steve stumbles towards me and points the gun at me. I back up into my place when he pulls the trigger. Nothing happened. He looks down at it like he's wondering what happened too, when Mark comes up and throws a huge haymaker from behind, and I heard Steve's jaw snap. Steve falls to the ground, the other guys had run off, and we can hear the police sirens coming around the corner. Long story shorter, the police arrested Steve for assault and a slew of other things, and it turns out he had more warrants to go with that. They caught the other guys later that night, or morning, I guess. My friends and I didn't get away scot-free, though. After telling the police the entire story, we got reamed for underage drinking, which I guess we were guilty of. But they didn't take any of our beer, which I thought was funny. We found out later that they did talk to the guys at Aces about us hanging around in there, and that needed to come to an end. Funny? It didn't. About a month later, we were there when one of the cops came in off duty with his wife. He saw us and just shook his head. We had to show up in court to testify as to what Steve did, and I'll be honest, my parents were not thrilled with me and what I had gotten myself into. I still have the scar above my eye, but it's not that bad. Looking back at what I wrote, I kind of glossed over the gun thing because it happened so fast. At the time, it was just surreal. But now that I have kids and I'm looking back at that situation, it's terrifying to me. I mean, I came so close to getting shot, and that scares the shit out of me as an adult. I don't remember what happened to Steve and his friends other than going to jail. But I do know I spent 3 more years at that school and in that area, and I never saw them again. The Indian in the Mountains. About a dozen years ago, when I was a grad student in anthropology, I was on a final expedition in the high mountains in the western U.S. For obvious reasons, I'm not going to specify where. This field work took us deep into the back country at elevations above 8,000 feet, and we had to make do with very basic survey and excavation techniques and equipment because we had to haul everything on our backs. After a few days of digging and cataloging artifacts at several sites on a high ridge, we were preparing to close up shop and head back to base camp. A few hours earlier, a small group of my fellow students had been sent out to look for potential new sites in a nearby creek drainage area, but they had failed to return to the rendezvous point at the agreed-upon time. Our expedition leader was less than happy. He took a few students down the valley to look for the party, and sent me up the trail on my own to base camp to wait if they showed up there. It was about 4 miles back to base camp, and when I arrived, the missing party was already there, drinking beer and having a great old time. Fuck. We had radios, but the boss was way out of range, so I dropped my pack and hoofed it back up to the trail to try to get some reception. It was getting towards twilight, and I was completely shot from 5 days of traipsing up and down steep ravines, lugging 70 pounds worth of pack over 25 miles of trail. Top that with eating freeze-dried food and digging in the dirt. Now, I'm running back up the mountain, and I'm feeling a little, let's say, unhinged. Blood sugar dropping, stressed out, just plain tired. And when I topped a small hill, that's when I saw him. A tall Native American man, buckskins and bow, long braid down his back. A fucking cliche, I know, but real as hell. Real enough that I called out to him, said hello, and asked him if he saw anybody else on the trail recently. He turned slowly my way, looked me in the eye, and then just disappeared into the forest. And by disappeared, I mean vanished into the underbrush in deadfall. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I felt my stomach fall into my shoes, and suddenly I was very, very cold. Again, I know, the cliches. I called out to him again, still convinced that he was real, and spun to look around behind me in the fading daylight. And there he was again. Back turned to me, he was walking slowly and silently down the trail back towards our camp. He faded out into the sunset, and I was totally freaked out. I was yelling at him over and over, but then he was gone, vanished into the nothingness once again. My boss came over the radio right at that moment.
Hello? Yeah, everyone's accounted for, boss. They're back in camp. Great. Thanks. We'll be there in a little while. Hey, Did you see anybody else while you were out there? Anybody on the trail? Maybe an Indian guy? Nope. Oh, okay.
And then this happened. I got myself to move forward and return to camp, and there was a perfect arrowhead lying dead center in the middle of the trail. A huge, notched chert thing, just sitting there. Now, if you know anything about North American archaeology, you know that trails are actually a pretty decent place to find stuff like this. The natural erosion that occurs on trails often reveals artifacts, and the people who lived on this continent for thousands of years often utilized the same travel corridors that we do in the present. And they left a lot of things behind. But now, right now, on a trail that a dozen anthropologists and anthropology students had traversed multiple times in the last week, that I had just hiked over an hour earlier, nobody had seen it, including me? At this point, I'm taking really deep breaths and trying to make sense of all this. I'm a scientist, right? There's lots of explanations. Fatigue, hallucination, the effects of high altitude, and so on. But I cannot shake the idea that this guy was real. He looked me right in the eye. He moved through the world. He dropped this damn arrowhead. I picked it up, turned it over, and left it in the ferns by the side of the trail. I had handled too many objects once owned by dead people over the last week to even consider documenting or thinking about this anymore. Hey, who knows if it was real anyway? I'm a born skeptic, but I'm absolutely convinced that I saw a ghost that afternoon. My colleagues back at camp, after I related my story, just handed me a beer. Haunted School Elevator, submitted by Patty T. Hi, I went to a university in the Midwest and dormed at a building that had 4 floors. Every other floor was guys or girls. I am a girl, by the way. There were stairwells at each corner of the building, but there was also an elevator that would and wouldn't work sometimes. This was taking place in the early 2000s, but it seemed like there were always maintenance guys working on the elevator, and one time some guys got stuck between floors. Some of us believed it was a mechanical issue, but others said it was the ghost of a man who died in the elevator after he got stuck during a summer break when he was working as a janitor. There was a team of people working to clean up all the damage from students the year before, and they would all go floor to floor working. This is true. His name was Tim, and at the end of one day, a Friday, the workers had all finished the building and were ready to move on to the next dorm on the following Monday. For some reason, Tim was the last one to leave and went to the basement to take care of something. No one really knows what. Well, when he got into the elevator, it went down but got stuck between the first floor and the basement. I have no idea what happened or why no one heard him or if he hit the fire button that's in most elevators, but he was stuck there for over a week before someone found him. He spent his last days stuck in a little elevator, probably screaming for help. So this happened about 20 years before I went to school there. Like I said, the elevator always acted weird and would run constantly on weekends when no one was pushing the buttons. We would have movie nights, and because it was just down the hallway, and because dorm policy was that we had to keep our doors open if boys were in our rooms and vice versa, we would hear the elevator going up and down over and over and over when no one was in it. One night my boyfriend Alex decided to try and put a stop to it by riding it over and over saying prayers. He did it for about a half hour, going up and down, praying. Then his roommate Barry said that they should say one more prayer and leave a Bible in the elevator and see what happened. They got a bunch of their buddies together and set up people on each floor to see what would happen as the elevator went up and down on its own. When it got to the second floor, the doors opened and there was the Bible. Same for the third and fourth floor and on the way back down. When it went to the basement and came back up to the first floor, the Bible was gone. It was in there in the basement, but when it came back up, gone. We are all very religious people, and no one was pulling any pranks. I know because I was one of the people in the basement when this happened, and that King James Bible was in the elevator when it came down there. We were freaked out and had a prayer vigil that night. I stopped caring about the elevator and moved to a different dorm building the next year. This might not sound scary to people, but we were very scared at the time. I have no explanation what happened there, I do think there is some kind of religious significance, and I do wonder what happened to that Bible. The High Noon Standoff by Variable Booleans. I lived in a handful of different apartment communities with my mom for the majority of my teenage years. Some better than others. Incidentally, this occurred in the best of all of them. I was 16 at the time. There were a group of girls around 10 years old that I liked to hang around and play volleyball with. They hated me because I used to get with another kid and throw water balloons at them while they were playing. In hindsight, this was pretty creepy in and of itself, but at the time it was hilarious. Well, I'd probably be the last person they would have ever visited. One day when I was playing GTA in the middle of a summer day, they came and knocked on my door. I was going to make a smart-ass comment, but they looked pretty distressed, so I asked them what was wrong. They told me there was a weird guy driving around near where they were hanging out and wanted me to come by. I was the oldest kid in the complex, so it makes sense they would come to me for this. We went and got my buddy, who was 14 at the time, and went over there. Well, they were right. We got there, and there was this guy in an old truck still there just watching us approach. I was pretty fearless, so I flipped him off and started throwing a football with my friend for a while. The girls went back to playing volleyball. This is where it gets absolutely crazy. After about 10 minutes, the guy gets out and starts walking towards all of us. We decide to get the hell out of there, so we walk back towards my place, and he follows. I tell everybody to book it, so we start running, and he starts running behind us. At this point, I decide I'm going to get my mom's gun and scare this guy away. So we beat him back to my apartment and lock the door. I get the gun. Unloaded. Total idiocy. I go back outside to find he's still waiting with a nasty look on his face. I look him dead in the eye and tell him to get the fuck out of here and point the gun at him. He smiles, reaches into his belt, and raises his own gun right back at me. It's at this point that I completely shit myself for the first time in the encounter. I know I can't fire. I went completely numb standing there, gun raised for what felt like years. It was probably only about 15 seconds. Neither of us said a word. After that eternity, he finally lowered his gun and walked away. We called the cops, but omitted the part about my gun, but they never found the guy. I have not pulled a gun on anyone else since then, thankfully. I was the neighborhood badass forever after that, though, but I absolutely did not want that designation. I didn't sleep for weeks. I can still clearly see the barrel of that dude's gun staring me down. I felt like the smallest dude on the world for those 15 seconds. I Fucking Hate People by Investigative Journo. A bit of background. I'm a 24-year-old male, recently became an independent freelance journalist after quitting my job at a popular newspaper. I am fairly successful, got a couple of well-paying people buying my stories, so that's awesome. I live in a really good neighborhood. A housemate and I bought a house with the money she was saving, and along with my money from my most recent article buyer. My neighbors usually keep to themselves. We don't worry about break-ins around here, and we can, the neighbors insist, leave our back doors unlocked. We don't. My housemate started noticing things going missing, things being moved around, money from our change jar vanishing, food from our cupboards disappearing. Naturally, she blamed me for these mishaps, even though I had vehemently assured her I was not to blame. But a year ago, when I left to meet my latest employer for a couple of days, these mishaps continued. She started freaking out and begged me to leave early, so I ended up rescheduling my meeting with the newspaper editor and left immediately. My housemate refused to stay there alone because she felt violated, so she was there with her then-boyfriend. As I pulled my car into the driveway, I heard a bit of movement inside. I didn't think much of it, but I did think it was odd because it was going on 2 a.m, and both her and her boyfriend were early sleepers. I got my keys out and tried to unlock the door. There was a key in the keyhole already, so I couldn't unlock it, but as I tried in vain to somehow push the key in, the movement abruptly stopped. Then suddenly I could hear heavy footsteps, loudly thudding against the floorboards and making its way to the door. The sound stopped just as it reached the door, and all I could hear was my breathing, along with the breathing of the person behind the door. After a couple of seconds, it occurred to me that the person must be looking at me through the peephole, so I flashed a smile and waved a bit. After about 2 minutes, I started to grow agitated. I knew it must have been either my housemate or her boyfriend behind the door, since I could hear the breathing, but why weren't they opening? In anger, I shouted for my housemate to open up and screamed that it was no longer funny. That's when, all at the same time, I saw the upstairs bedroom light, my housemate's, flick on, and the person behind the door running, followed by the opening and closing of what I assume was the back door. After 10 long seconds, my front door opened, and standing in the doorway was my housemate and her boyfriend. My housemate was on the phone, talking to who I later learned was the police, and her boyfriend was worriedly watching her. After 5 minutes, she stated that the police were on their way. Confused, I started to question them and learned that neither of them were standing in the front room the time I came, but were fast asleep in my housemate's room. I realized it had to have been the mishap man. Funnily enough, it wasn't the thought that he broke in and could have killed my friends that scared me. What scared me the most was that he could have stolen my PC I spent a year building and upgrading, and that he could have been eating my food. We waited in the doorway for the police to arrive in fear we would tamper with any evidence if we moved. The police examined our house for the remainder of the night and a large portion of the next day, but could not find any forced entry or unusual fingerprints anywhere around the house. They advised us to install an anti-burglar alarm and other various security systems, but we really couldn't afford it at that time, so we decided we would have to do without. My housemate moved out to her boyfriend's apartment until we could both scrape up enough money to buy the security system. I stayed with a renewed lividity. I wasn't going to leave the house I had bought when the whole world kept saying millennials like me wouldn't own a house. After about a week without any mishaps, I left the house, which I was actively trying not to do, but I wanted to buy some pizza. I thought it would be safer to go during the day since burglars usually don't burgle during the day. After I ordered the pizza and eaten it, I drove home. But as I opened the door, I could feel that something was awry. I didn't know what it was, but I could sense something was off. I looked around for a bit and found that the mishap man had struck again. He hadn't taken anything, he never does. He just ate or stole some food from the fridge. But I was really fucking sick of it. I kept assuring myself when we would get the security system this will all stop, and it calmed me down a bit. I didn't leave the house for a while after that, choosing rather to order my food online, and when I did leave the house, it was only to meet potential employees to purchase my articles, and even then I'd hire someone to sit at the house. After about 3 weeks of me doing that, I had a real craving for McDonald's. I just couldn't resist it. So I drove off as fast as the speed limit would let me, and sometimes above, to get my food and drive back. As I rounded the corner of my road, I saw someone with a black hoodie with the hood over the person's head fumbling at my door. I hoot. The person pauses, looks in my direction, and the minute the person sees me, he sets off sprinting towards a motorcycle I hadn't noticed that was lying on the sidewalk, and he takes off. I didn't even bother chasing him. I got out of my car, ran to my door, and rushed to take out my keys. But as I take them out, I notice there is already a key in the door. I ran back to my car, took out a spectacle wiper, and ran to the door to take out the key. The minute I took it out, I almost fucking drop it. It's the same fucking door key as the one I have. But to my knowledge, there were only supposed to be two, mine and my housemate's. I didn't hesitate to call the police and my housemate to come over. I explained everything to the police and my housemate, and they advised me to change the locks immediately and get that security system they told me about last time. The next day, my housemate and I took out a loan and replaced the locks, and I made sure there are only 2 copies of the keys, and I buy one of the newer models of the security system we were urged to buy. It did take a while to pay off the loan. The mishaps abruptly stopped after that, and we've never had another encounter with that fucking mishap man. The cornfield incident. I've never been a believer in the supernatural, and I've always been pretty skeptical of any paranormal stories I've ever heard. I'm not sure if this story fits into this category, but I'm going to tell it anyway. When I was a senior in high school, I was over at my girlfriend's parents' house for the day. And they lived off a dirt road in a very rural area. Not too many neighbors close by, and the entire property is surrounded by cornfields, with the exception of the backyard where there were stables and horses. It was a very nice sunny day in late summer, and nothing was out of the ordinary. Both her parents were home, and I was helping my girlfriend finish up some of her weekend chores. I was finishing up the dishes while she proceeded to take the trash out to the garage. And I heard the garage door motor go off, and shortly after, she came running back inside, right over and grabbed me. She seemed very spooked about something, and I asked her what was wrong. She said that the garage door just opened by itself while she was on the other side of the garage, putting the trash bags in the can. She then started to hear someone crying in the cornfield on the other side of the driveway. Her mother was in the room and heard this, so we all walked out into the garage. Sure enough, the garage door was open, and the sounds of what I think was a child crying was coming from somewhere in the cornfield a short distance from where we were standing. Her mother went back in the house and called for her dad, while I walked over to the edge of the cornfield to see if I could see anyone. Unfortunately, by the end of the summer, the corn is pretty dense and very difficult to see through. The crying continued, and now my girlfriend's father had come out and was standing next to me. And the crying, or more like sobbing, sounded like a little kid who had just gotten lost, but the closest neighbor was more than a half-mile away, and they were an older couple that didn't have any kids. My girlfriend's father called out, "Hello? Are you okay?" And instantly the crying stopped. And then we both started calling out, "Hello? Hello?" Nothing but silence. My girlfriend's father told me the kid must be scared and to keep calling out. He was going to go inside and call the police. I yelled out a few more times, but my calls went unanswered. Suddenly, in the direction of where the cries were coming from, there was a loud crack. Loud enough to where I actually ducked, like a large tree snapping in half, and then the sounds of smaller cracks, like someone breaking branches. Only there weren't any trees in the field. I looked back to the garage from the edge of the cornfield, and my girlfriend and her mom had that look on their face of, what the hell was that? With anxiety building up inside of me and thinking that a child might be in danger, I darted into the cornfield, calling out, "Where are you? Tell me where you are. I want to help you." Pushing my way through the corn and not being able to see more than a couple of feet in front of me, I started making my way towards the cracking sounds, which were quickly but gradually fading away. After a few more seconds, I couldn't hear anything at all. I called out again, still no response. I then dropped to the ground, hoping to be able to see further through the base of the corn stalks, and then the leaves on top. I could see much further, but there was nothing there, just more corn. I heard my girlfriend's father calling out my name, and I followed his voice back to the edge of the cornfield. As I made my way out, several police cars were starting to arrive. We told the police about the crying and that we thought a kid might be lost or hurt. So 2 officers, one being a canine unit, went into the cornfield, while 2 other police cars drove the perimeter of the cornfield. After about an hour, the officers emerged from the field and told us that they didn't find anything, not even a scent for the dog to follow. The patrolling officers said they spoke with a farmer that lives on the other side of the cornfield, miles from my girlfriend's parents' house, and he told the officers he saw 2 local boys that he lets hunt on his property come out of the cornfield early that morning. The police seemed pretty confident that this was some kind of misunderstanding at best, or a stupid prank at worst. I'm not so sure. The farmer said he saw the boys early in the morning leaving the cornfield, but we heard the crying in the late afternoon. And how did the garage open by itself? What was that cracking noise? Who was crying? And why did they stop the second we called out to them? Now for the really strange part. About 10 years after this event took place, and many years after I had forgotten completely about it, my now ex-girlfriend called me out of the blue. After a brief, "Hey, what have you been up to? How are you?" she tells me the real reason for her call. She asked me if I remembered the cornfield incident, and then told me that her mom is volunteering at a senior center, and one of the people she cares for is the older neighbor of theirs that lives about half a mile down the road. One day, in casual conversation about a recent farming accident that the 2 were reading about in the newspaper, the neighbor starts telling my ex-girlfriend's mother about an accident that happened in the early 30s. Apparently, in the very same cornfield where we heard the crying, a young boy was killed when he accidentally fell in front of some kind of farm equipment that the father was driving. The boy's father, who was a heavy drinker, didn't even notice he had just run over his son, and the boy's body wasn't found for several days. It definitely leaves me wondering, could we have been hearing the past cries of this injured young boy, hoping for someone to find him? Or was it just a coincidence? And at this point, I really couldn't say. but I certainly won't be forgetting that day anytime soon. My Time as a Mormon Missionary by Brian D. Between 2006 and 2008, I was a Mormon missionary. My mission was in Utah, go figure. One night in December of 2006, I was serving in Springville, Utah with my companion. We had gotten dinner at a local Mexican place, and while we were there, we met a mother and her 16-year-old daughter from Oaxaca. My companion and I both spoke Spanish. They began telling us problems that they had been having with their younger 12-year-old daughter who wasn't there. A lot of creepy stuff had been happening, and the young girl had been acting out. They told us how the younger girl would be breaking stuff and screaming nonsense at them. The 16-year-old was terrified and told us about one incident when she was using the mirror in her sister's room to take a picture on her camera. The girl had a sad clown poster in her bedroom, and when she took the picture of herself in the mirror, she looked at it and saw that the clown was smiling. She freaked out and deleted the photo, and from then on would avoid her sister's room at all costs. The younger sister seemed to have no problem with her room, though, and laughed at her mother and sister when they showed obvious fear. The mother and daughter asked us to come over to their apartment and bless it to get rid of whatever spirit they thought was there. I should point out at this point, I was extremely skeptical. As a missionary, you don't really get called to perform exorcisms like you see in the movies, and I was pretty sure they were just being superstitious. Nonetheless, we obliged and went over. The younger girl was staying at her friend's house, so it was just me, my companion, the mother and the daughter, and another guy who lived next door to them. It's Utah, so like all her neighbors are Mormon, and missionary rules stipulate that two missionaries can't be alone in a home with the opposite sex without another male non-missionary being there. When we got there, I felt this immediate sinking feeling inside of their home. The younger daughter's room was visible from the living room. The door was open, and it was completely dark inside. I knew that clown poster was in there, and I was curious to see it. But as I stepped towards the room, the hair on my arm stood up, and I could feel this huge sense of fear coming over me. My companion and I spoke with them a little bit more while they told us more about the daughter. The entire time I could feel the sense of dread emanating from the bedroom behind me. We eventually knelt down to pray. My missionary companion was just going to say a simple prayer, asking that the Holy Ghost be in their home so they could feel better. About 10 seconds into the prayer, my companion stops talking. I open my eyes, and he is sitting there, eyes closed, but he can't speak. His tongue is like stuck to the roof of his mouth, and I could see he was struggling to form any words. And at this moment, the daughter screamed, and I looked over and saw the mother crawling on all fours, moving erratically forward like she couldn't control her body. At this second, all three of us guys jumped up and raised our right hands to the square and simultaneously repeated a prayer that you learn in Mormon temples to cast out demons. The mother stopped, and we all sat there shaken up for a few minutes. I was way beyond terrified by this time, though, and my companion and I promptly got the fuck out and never spoke of the incident again. By the way, I'm not Mormon anymore. I don't know if I believe in God or what, but that really happened, and it scared the shit out of me. Terror on the Highway by formerly Dick Move. Something happened to me last winter that really freaked me out. I work in Chicago but live in Columbus, Ohio. I commute home every other weekend, and I've been doing this for 4 years or so I pretty much have my roots down. I drive because flying is too much money, and it's kind of a hassle. From Illinois to Ohio, I take the 80-94 to 65 south to 70 east. It's boring but quick. On the way back, I go a different way. From Columbus, I take 270 to Route 23 north to US 30 west. I take the freeway around Fort Wayne and take 30 all the way to the 80 Turnpike. Last January, I needed to be in the office on Monday. I usually work from home. So I left at like 2 a.m., which would get me to work at 7:30 or 8 a.m. after changing at my apartment. I'm very used to the route and know exactly where the rest stops are and gas stations with decent coffee. The first rest stop I stopped at was on Route 23, about an hour out. I stopped here because it's a good 2 hours to the next one. I used the urinal, and written on top in very neat handwriting, it said, "I want to suck your hard cock. 1:18, 11:30 p.m., about 3 hours ago." Above the urinal on the wall was a pretty decent cartoon of a cock being sucked. Next to it was a depiction of anal sex, and written beside that was, "I want your hard cock in my ass." I finished up and noticed there were several trucks parked in the lot, and I kind of wondered if it was one of them and if they found their good time. I got in my car and drove off. I have a Subaru Forester with a sticker on the rear window that says Ohio State Dad. I stopped for more coffee at a Speedway and got on US 30 heading west. Just after I-75, I pulled into another rest area. I walked in and was shocked at what was written on the walls. It was the same cartoonist, but this time the cartoon pictured a vivisection. Very realistic organs were next to a torso, and a kneeling man had his face fully entrenched in the body cavity. I have to admit, this kind of scared me, but I had to piss. On top of the urinal was written, "I want to rip you apart and fuck your guts. I want to eat your shit-filled intestines. 1:19, 2:45 a.m. I looked at my watch. It was just after 4:30. I was gaining on this guy. I couldn't stop thinking about this. I think the fact that the drawings were so professional and the spelling was so good that it creeped me out even more. I drove on. I watched as I passed cars and trucks, and I tried to see in the windows, but it was still dark. I was passed only twice, once by a big BMW and once by an older Chevy Impala. Both had Indiana plates. An hour and a half later, I was approaching the next rest stop. I didn't really have to go, but I had to see if there was more graffiti. I was the only car in the parking lot, and there were a couple of trucks. I walked to the bathroom. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was more than a little afraid, and that I had gotten a wrench out of the toolbox I carried with me on these trips. The second I hit the lobby, I could smell shit. I almost turned around, but I had to look. I walked into the men's room. The lights are automatic, and they flickered on. In foot-high letters, written in shit, which I think it was shit anyway, it said, "Almost there, Dad. Ohio. Lol." I almost fainted. The thick smell of shit and the fact that somehow I knew they were talking to me just freaked me out. Dad? Ohio? Ohio State Dad? I stepped back and then noticed a raccoon or a groundhog or something had been ripped apart, and its carcass and guts were laying next to a stall. I got the fuck out of there. Once outside, I felt better, but as I walked to my car, I heard a whispered bark and I swear some muffled laughter. I looked around, but it was dark, and there were bushes and trees all over, but no one was there. I didn't want to run because I knew if I did I would panic. So I fast-walked, got in my car, started it up, and got on the road. Once my phone had synced up, I called 911 and reported the vandalism at the last rest stop. They took the call like no big deal, and I didn't elaborate. I was about 5 minutes from Indiana. 5 minutes into Indiana, I noticed emergency flashers on the side of the road up ahead. It was the Impala that had passed me hours ago. A guy was standing with his thumb out just ahead of his car, illuminated by the headlights. It was maybe 18 degrees, and he wore just a hoodie. He looked cold, and I almost stopped. But as I slowed, I noticed dark brown stains on his yellow sweatshirt, and his hands were filthy with something dark. Maybe it was grease from trying to fix his car, or maybe it was shit and blood. I sped up, and his thumb turned into the finger, and his other hand joined it, and he screamed at me. His mouth seemed too wide, and his teeth looked too small, and it looked like there were too many of them. I was freaking out. I downshifted, jumped on the accelerator, and took off. I called 911 again and reported the stranded motorist. I didn't make a big deal about it, just gave the mile marker number. I didn't tell him that he had screamed, "Fuck you, Ohio." I didn't stay on US 30. I took US 69 to the turnpike and only stopped where there were a lot of people. I tried looking for any mention of the vandalism or the stranded motorist, but I didn't see anything. I now rent a car every trip, and I don't use US 30. Crazy Teacher Relationship, or Not As Cool As You Think. Submitted by Stay Gold Ponyboy. My name is not Ponyboy, But that's what I'm going with here, is this story is kind of fucked up, and the last thing I need is to be identified. I'm sending you this because of all the people out there who think it would be super cool to have a relationship with a hot female teacher. It's not what it's cracked up to be, I assure you. So, when I was a senior in high school, I took a computer class being taught by a woman who worked as an IT person and taught a few classes too. She was young, super hot, and always dressed borderline inappropriate. If it matters, this was a town in Florida, but I'm not saying where. I had a girlfriend a year younger than me, and I'm not going to be proud about this because I did cheat on her. Anyway, let's call girlfriend Ann and teacher Susan. Why? I pulled those names out of my ass. The computer class was pretty easy, and it was more about using programs than not programming, which I thought it was going to be. This is when PowerPoint first came out, so someone decided that there should be a course about using Microsoft stuff. After I knew Susan was going to be teaching it, I stayed. Call me a perv, but she was only 21 and I was 18. I knew something was up just in the way that we talked about my projects in class, and the way she looked at me. I was just a kid and happy with my girlfriend, but I was also a kid and falling for this older woman. One day she asked me to stay after school to help her with something, and I told her I could, but I had to leave after a while because I had practice. I played basketball and ran track. So I went to her class at the end of the day, and she was sitting at her desk computer and asked me to check out this new thing she did with PowerPoint. I can't remember exactly what it was, but maybe something about embedding a video, which was a big deal at the time. She got up, I sat in her chair, and she leaned over me, and her boobs were literally on my neck. I got the hint, and this story isn't about what we did, but we did. It's what happened afterwards that things got really scary. I was stupid and started a sexual relationship with her behind Anne's back. Susan bought me all kinds of cool things and clothes, and I would secretly meet her at the mall or at the movies or wherever. I did notice, though, that she was constantly watching me at school and would get pissed off if I was ever near Anne. Susan showed up at my basketball games and later track meets and wanted to talk to me after them, but Anne was usually there because she was a cheerleader and ran track too. I started noticing her around the fringes a lot more, and I even saw Susan in the parking lot of my church one Sunday morning looking for me. I'm not going to lie, I loved the sex with her. She was a bit more advanced than Anne, and I know it makes me a creep to say that. It's been like 25 years, and I know it's easy to say I was just a kid, but it's true, I was. We had a senior trip to Austin, Texas for some music festival, and Susan went as a chaperone. I remember getting on the bus after saying goodbye to my parents and Anne giving Susan a death look, and I wondered if she knew what was going on. Anyway, we got to Austin, and on the second night there was a soft tap on my door. My roommate and friend Mike was asleep, so I got up, and it was Susan, who quickly smuggled me into her room. She wanted sex, so I obliged. But she brought the condoms, and after the second time, a condom broke. I thought this was odd because it had never happened before. I didn't say anything, but grabbed the box and went back to my room, not getting caught by another chaperone. I went into the bathroom and pulled out the condoms and saw that they had all been pierced by something, but not so big as they would break when I put them on. I was angry and scared. What the hell was Susan trying to do? We got back home from the trip, and one night I had to go to the library to work on a final project. Susan had followed me there, and I told her I needed to talk to her. We sat in her car, and I brought up the condom thing and said that I wasn't going to get her pregnant, and she got really mad that I accused her of that. I snapped and told her it was over and that she needed to leave me alone. I got out of her car and she screamed, and I mean screamed, "This is only over when I say it's over, pony boy." I slammed the door and went back into the library. Sorry so much of this is backstory, but I think it's important to know where I was and what happened up to this point, because this is when the crazy shit started to happen. I started getting these typed notes in my locker that were threatening to expose me to my girlfriend Anne, and of course I knew where they were coming from. One told me that if I took Anne to the prom, we'd both be sorry, and that one was true. I didn't have money for a limo, so I took Anne to the prom with my uncle's Cadillac convertible. 2 other friends, Tom and Nikki, let's call them, went with us. Prom was fun. I was honestly getting ready to tell Anne what I had done in a few days, but on our way to an after-prom party, this car started following us real close. After a bunch of turns and the car still following, I sped up, but the car did too and then zoomed by us. And that's when I saw it was Susan's car. I'm not kidding. She threw a milkshake out of her moonroof and it splattered all over the caddy and got on all of us. I slowed down and she took off. The girls all screamed and I knew this was all my fault and I played dumb. We got cleaned up and went to the party at our friend's house, and after we changed into swimsuits and calmed down, we told everyone at the party what had happened. While we were having a good time and swimming and just hanging out, our friend's mother asked who the woman standing at the hedge was. We all looked, but there was no one there. But I knew who it was. Anne shot me a look, and she must have known and was maybe waiting for me to do the right thing. But I got out of the pool and ran over to the hedge with Tom right behind me. There was Susan, crouching behind a tree. I told Tom I would handle it, and I later told him everything, and he kept it quiet. I walked over to her, telling her that she needed to leave and that I wouldn't say anything about the milkshake. She literally grabbed my crotch and told me, "Ponyboy, if you don't meet me tomorrow, I'll cut it off." At this point, I was getting scared. I knew I fucked up, but this was too much. I told her I would meet her, and she said to meet at the library parking lot. I went back to the party and told everyone it was just some drunk lady and she had wandered away. Later, I took Anne home and wanted to tell her, but again I chickened out. She asked if we were going to another party the next day, and I told her I would pick her up, and yes, we were going. When I got home, my parents were asleep, and I just went to my room. My phone, I had my own line. My sister got a TV and a Nintendo. I got a phone. My phone rang. Who else would it be? Susan started babbling about how she was coming over and that nothing was over and that she would tell everyone I raped her if I didn't go along. I told her I would meet her the next day and hung up. She called back and I finally turned off the ringer, but she just kept calling and leaving these crazy messages on my machine that I kept because they were threatening me to the point where the last one said she was going to kill both of us. About 4 a.m, I heard a tap at my bedroom window and opened the blinds. There was Susan, standing naked in my yard. "I want to come in, Ponyboy," she said flatly. I should have called the cops. I should have told my parents. I should have done something, but all I did was close the blinds and got back into bed. She left after tapping the window again, saying, "I love you, Ponyboy." That morning I called Tom and asked him to go with me, but hide in the library parking lot with a camera and take pictures of me. I don't know why. It seemed like the right thing to do at the time. I told my parents some bullshit about where I had to go real quick, and Tom met me up the street. I drove to the library and let Tom out a block or so away so he could hide in the parking lot. When I got there, the lot was empty except for Susan's car. I walked over to it and she said to get in. I did, but kept the door open and had one leg outside. She started the car up, but I started to get out and told her we weren't going anywhere, and that I was going to my dad and the cops if she didn't leave me alone. She screamed that she was going to fail me in class and that I wouldn't be able to graduate on time and go to college, and that she would tell Anne about us. I told her I already told Anne, which was a total lie, and that it was done and she needed to grow up. She slapped me, burst into tears, and then tried to hug me. I got out of the car, and she was just crying and crying as I went to my car. I had to take it back to my uncle. I left her there and picked up Tom, and we got out of Dodge. I immediately went to Anne's house and told her everything, and that I ruined everything, and that I was a terrible human being. Of course she was pissed off, but she said she thought something was going on. She cried and punched me and called me lots of names, which I deserved. Anne told me that I had to tell my dad what happened, and she was going with me to make sure that I did. I guess that was her way of getting back at me, as my parents were super religious and forbade me from having sex or anything like that. I drove home, let Tom out at his house, and when I got to my place, whose car was in the driveway? Susan's. She was standing at the door of my house getting ready to ring the doorbell when Anne screamed out at her. Susan ran at us and tried to tackle me to the ground as Anne kept screaming at her to leave me alone. My parents came out and so did the neighbors as Susan kept going on and on with all this crazy bullshit. My mom called the cops, and they showed up and detained Susan, and now I had to tell everyone about my stupidity. Susan was still going crazy, and the police actually had to do that thing where they tie your feet to your hands when they put her in the car. Long story longer, my parents were devastated. Anne broke up with me, although we're still friends now, but I didn't press charges against Susan because deep down I knew she was messed up and didn't want her to lose her job. My dad agreed, but my mom didn't. She didn't talk to me for months until I left for college, and even then it was all about how I let her down and needed to get back to the Bible. She even cussed Anne out about our relationship. Anyway, that happened a long time ago, and the only reason I'm thinking of it now is because I found this channel and heard you ask for school stories. The other reason is because I got a friend request from Susan about 2 years ago on Facebook. She sent a message that said, "We did have fun though, didn't we?" Needless to say, I blocked her. Room 232. A bit of quick background knowledge about my family. My dad does not believe in the supernatural. He's a strict Roman Catholic and was previously a priest. Due to his strong beliefs, he ignored or turned his nose up to any experiences that I had. My mom had always been open-minded about ghosts and the afterlife. She has never said that she believes in ghosts or supernatural activities, but she's always had an interest in that side of things, even at a young age. She too is a Roman Catholic. Anyway, back to my story. In 1997, when I was 9 years old, my mom, dad, and I went on holiday to Majorca. It was my first holiday abroad, and I was really looking forward to it. We were going to be staying in a hotel for 2 weeks, and I think it was on my 12th night of my holiday that something happened. I was in room 232, and it was an all-in-one room, basically with 3 beds and some wardrobes. My bed was nearest to the balcony, and on this particular night I woke up. I don't remember what time it was because I didn't have a clock near me. Anyway, everyone was asleep, and I sat up in bed and had a sip of the drink I had set on one of the set of drawers next to me. I tried to get back to sleep and couldn't because I felt hot, so I pulled the top cover of the bed sheets down so I only had a sheet covering me. Again, I laid back down trying to go back to bed and pulled my feet apart. I sleep with my feet apart for some weird reasons. While trying to get back to sleep, I began frustrated that I just didn't feel tired enough. I opened my eyes and looked around the room, hoping that after looking around for a bit, I'd become tired and I could go back to sleep. While I was looking around the room, I was drawn to something white and misty looking near the door of the hotel room. I remember squinting my eyes to see it more clearly, but it didn't help at all. This white thing then began to move towards the end of my bed. It might sound a bit cliché, but I can still remember feeling completely petrified as this white thing formed into the figure of a man in black trousers and a white shirt. The figure looked Spanish, and he had all these Spanish features. I couldn't help but think that he was an old member of staff that worked at the hotel, and now I still don't know where that thought came from. Anyway, I was looking at this man in his shirt and black trousers, not knowing what to do, and I started to feel really scared. All of a sudden, this red bow tie appeared on his shirt. And it really scared me because the rest of the figure was sort of blurry, but now this red bow tie was terribly vivid. I closed my eyes, thinking it was just my imagination, but when I opened them, the figure was still there. The figure was still staring at me, his eyes vividly brown. The scariest part was when he lifted up his arm and held it in the air. I remember thinking, he looks like he's about to hit something. As I was still petrified of this figure, I didn't dare move a muscle. All of a sudden, his arm came flying down, and I swear it hit my foot. Well, I totally lost it. I began screaming and crying, and pulled myself to the top of the bed, and as I did this, I saw the figure just disappear. My mom and dad obviously woke up because of the noise I was making, and asked me what the hell was wrong. I was in a state, and I found it hard getting my words out to tell them what had happened. Eventually, my mom had settled me down, and I told her everything, word for word. As I mentioned, my dad doesn't believe in ghosts, and he told me it was my imagination, but my mom believed that I had seen something. But she told me that I needed to get some sleep, and that we could discuss everything that had happened the next morning. The next morning, neither of my parents mentioned what had happened during the night. I later found out the reason they had said nothing was because they didn't want to scare me and wanted me to believe it was all just a dream and nothing more. However, I was still scared about what had happened, and I brought it up. So my parents listened to what had happened all over again. My parents didn't know what to say to me after I retold what had happened, and they were intrigued that I vividly remembered the red bow tie. At this point, we were just about to have breakfast, but my foot was aching, so I looked at it, and I found a really strange mark, exactly where the figure had hit me. I constantly asked my parents to find out about the uniforms the staff had to wear, but my parents told me the people working at the hotel didn't know what the uniform was like previously. It was only a few years later, when I was talking to my mom about something I experienced at my grandmother's house, which is another story, that I brought up what happened back then. My mom confessed that she and my dad did ask staff members if they knew what the previous uniforms looked like. She said the uniform had changed in the early 1990s, but before that, the staff had to wear black trousers, white shirts, and red bow ties. I swear all of this is true, and it really scared the hell out of me. I am now grateful that my mom didn't tell me what I saw was someone who likely once worked there and was now dead, because I never would have been able to stay in that room for another night. Post house. We live on an army post in Texas, Fort Hood to be exact, and I never really believed in the paranormal until we moved into this house. What follows is my true account. I don't expect you to believe it, because I never would have. We moved there around August of 1996, and the house is nice, but nothing special. A 2-story duplex. Downstairs is all tile floors, but the upstairs is the original wood the house was built with back in 1957. Everything that has happened in the house concerns the upstairs. Nothing has ever come downstairs. I know that sounds strange to say, but it's definitely how it feels. I talked to someone once, a person who was knowledgeable about the paranormal, and they thought that this may be due to the tile floors downstairs. The wooden natural floors upstairs would be more receptive to paranormal activity than the man-made asphalt tile of the lower portion of the house. That's the theory, at least. Before living here, I would have thought a statement like this was pretty nuts, really, but it feels right. The upstairs is definitely active in some way the downstairs has never been. Let me tell you some of what we have experienced here, and then I'll move on into the specifics of when I started to keep a journal of all this weirdness. The first thing was a night when we had another couple over to play cards. We were sitting at the dining room / kitchen table playing spades. I had faintly heard crying from time to time, but dismissed it as what I refer to as my mommy hearing. It's an instinctive thing. Ever since our first child was born, I have at times heard a baby crying when there was none, like an instinctive cue to check on the baby. I didn't really hear it probably, just a subconscious reminder to check on my kids. Hey, don't laugh. Lots of moms experience this. Anyway, I had been hearing it on and off, but ignoring it. We had 2 children at the time, and they were both older, ages 3.5 and 2, so if they were crying, believe me, I'd hear them a bit louder. Then, eventually, the other woman here noticed it as well, and commented that we must be picking up someone else's baby in our monitor. And we did have a baby monitor sitting on top of the bookshelves. I was a bit startled. I thought it was just my imagination, but now someone else heard it as well. The guys also said they heard it, and they all agreed that it was another baby in the neighborhood. Comments were made about other people's garage door openers opening your garage door, so picking up other conversations on a cordless phone on occasion also happened. And we were all joking about it. My husband said, "Honey, just turn the monitor off. We'll hear the kids if they wake up." I had gone white and was staring at the monitor when he said that. I was looking at the little red indicator light on the monitor. You know, the one that lights up when the monitor is turned on to let you know that it's working? Well, the monitor was not on. The light was not lit up. But the monitor still seemed to be broadcasting the sound of some baby crying. And again, not loudly, but still plainly coming from the monitor. When I mentioned that it wasn't on, my husband simply said, "No, the light's probably just broken, no big deal." We all agreed that that must be it. I went over to the bookshelves to turn it off, but like I said, it wasn't turned on. As I followed the cord to the wall, I noticed that even the AC adapter cord was not plugged in. Everyone commented and said it must just be on batteries. I was the only one that knew there were no batteries in the unit, so I removed the back and showed them that there were no batteries. It grew very quiet as we all contemplated what this could possibly mean. I had never come this close to the unexplainable before in my life. I mean, how could this be possible? I went upstairs to check on the girls and to check the other transmitting end of the baby monitor upstairs. We were all determined to explain this rationally, even though the transmitting end would have no effect on the impossibility of the receiving end operating while it was turned off. I mean, it didn't even have a power source. Still, we were determined to figure it out. When I got upstairs, the kids were sound asleep, and the button on the monitor was in the off position. But for some reason, I needed to physically verify that by touching the switch, as if my eyes couldn't be trusted. I had to make every effort to verify that this thing was indeed turned off. Just before I touched the monitor, my hand passed into a cold spot in the air. It was like a patch of almost Arctic air that it instantly made my whole body break out in goosebumps. I ran downstairs terrified, and realized that in my panic, I had left my children upstairs in the room with, and I couldn't finish that sentence even in my mind. Everyone reassured me that the kids were fine. I mean, it was freaky, but harmless. We laughed about it a lot for the rest of the night. The monitor only did that one other time that I can recall, and it was much shorter in duration. Another thing that happens frequently is footsteps on the stairs. I'll be sitting in the living room watching TV or reading when I hear someone coming down the stairs. Judging by the sounds, it sounded to be like a small child. I mean, the steps are uncertain somehow, and they're fairly light, definitely not the steps of an adult. The first time I heard it was when my kids were upstairs asleep at nap time. I thought it was my oldest, Emily, coming down when she was supposed to be taking a nap. At first I almost just yelled up, "Emily, get in bed," or something to that effect, but instead decided to surprise her and sneak up on her. Then I'd put her back in bed myself, rather than just make her get back in bed on her own. I waited, crouching on the lower 2 stairs. There are 10 wooden stairs, then a landing that turns a corner, then 2 more steps to the bottom. I was waiting to scare my daughter. The footsteps stopped, so I turned the corner, but the boo I was about to give off froze in my throat. The stairs were empty. There was no one there. It would have been impossible in any length of time for a 3.5-year-old child to sneak back up the stairs silently, let alone in the 1.5 seconds it took me to turn that corner. I just froze there, unbelieving my own eyes. Then I quietly went up the stairs, only to find both girls sound asleep in their beds. Emily was never on those steps, but someone was. I mean, I distinctly heard footsteps. There was no mistaking it. I was right there. The sounds weren't muffled or unearthly sounding. It just sounded like a kid clomping down the stairs. When I was pregnant with our youngest child, I was on a lot of bed rest and an inpatient numerous times. A very rough one. At one point, my sister-in-law came to stay for a little while, just to help out. We hadn't mentioned anything about the house to anyone. I mean, we actually felt kind of silly, I guess. I've always been interested in the paranormal, but I don't think I ever took any of it too seriously. Eventually, we just started talking about this and that, and my husband Michael was at work. The kids were asleep upstairs, and we were just passing the time, getting to know each other better and talking about whatever came to mind. She was talking about something of a paranormal nature, something we were watching on television perhaps reminded her of something a friend said, and that happened to them once. That kind of vague, it happened to someone else kind of discussion thing, but really interesting. For some reason, I started to tell her about the baby monitor and the footsteps. She said, "Like that, perhaps?" as a joke. It sounded as though Emily had woken up and was coming down to see us. Anna was younger, and her footsteps would have been less steady. It was definitely Emily. We were laughing, and I almost felt silly. The whole thing seemed ridiculous, until the footsteps rounded the corner. But not my kid. We both distinctly heard the footsteps continue past the landing and onto the first of the bottom 2 steps. Then they stopped. Except, like I said, there was no one there. It was the middle of the day, bright and sunny in the living room, and although we had to turn our heads to see the stairs, we both had an unobstructed view of the stairway landing. We stared at it, not believing our eyes, for what seemed like 5 minutes, but was probably more like around 10 seconds. I turned to my sister-in-law and said, "Yeah, about like that, but it's the first time he turned the corner." We both laughed, but it was a nervous laughter. I had goosebumps all over my body. Why he? I'm not sure. I had been thinking of it as a little boy around 3 or 4 years old, judging from the weight it sounded to have on the stairs, and the level of coordination. Not perfectly coordinated like an adult would be, but much more coordinated than, say, a toddler. The gender was a mystery, but it felt right to refer to it as a he. It felt as if it was a little boy, but I can't explain why. Later that week, I was kept overnight in the hospital, and my sister-in-law was watching the kids. She later told me that while I was gone, she had put the kids down for their nap and was sitting on the couch reading, when she heard someone upstairs, walking around the kids' room and moving toys around. Concerned that Emily would wake Anna up, she tiptoed up the stairs to bring her down to play where she wouldn't disturb her sleeping sister. She got upstairs. Both girls were fast asleep in their beds. The sounds had stopped when she got about halfway up the stairs, but there was no way one of them could have fallen back asleep by the time she got up there. It was not one of the girls that had made those noises. She ran back downstairs, panicked, and stood in the middle of the living room, and then said to herself, "Oh, God, I can't leave the girls up there." So she went back up the stairs. Then she thought, well, it's kind of silly to wake them, so she sat in their room for about 30 minutes reading, and then felt better about it and went back downstairs. I'm not so sure she was terribly unhappy to be sleeping downstairs on the couch, because things don't seem to happen down there. My cousin is the one who is knowledgeable about the paranormal, and she said that the asphalt tile downstairs would be a poor conductor for spiritual energy. The man-made flooring is dead and can't absorb psychic energy, but the wood upstairs is living in a way, having come from a natural living source. When I told my cousin about the events, she immediately asked me, "Have you figured out a way to use it yet?" Now, let me just say that the very idea gives me the willies and makes me want to change the subject. I've decided that I enjoy hearing about the paranormal and watching film footage on sightings and shows like that, but experiencing it personally is a different story. I'm really a chicken, and the whole thing creeps me out. One day my daughter Emily was playing with me quietly on the living room floor, and her sisters were asleep, when she said, "Mommy, I don't like that little boy." I casually asked, "What little boy, honey?" But I had chills. Emmy said, "The one that comes in my room sometimes." I wanted to find out more, but since she's only just turned 4, I had to be very careful that I wasn't leading in any way with my questions. I wanted to know what was happening without influencing her in any way. She said, "Well, he shouldn't be in my room without his mommy. He's little like me. He should stay with his mommy and daddy or he could get hurt." I said, "Yeah, he shouldn't be by himself. Is that why you don't want him in your room?" I was hoping that was it, that nothing else happened to frighten her. "His mommy doesn't even know he's here. It's dangerous to go without your mommy." I agreed and told her that maybe she should tell him that the next time she saw him. Then I asked what he does in her room, and she said, "He just looks at me. He's not for real." "What do you mean, sweetie?" She screwed her face up in concentration and then said, "Well, I can see him, but he's not there for real. And he's not pretend, though." I asked her something else, maybe to remind him that he shouldn't be there without his mom or something. I don't remember. But she had moved on and was insisting that I play Barbies some more. She was no longer interested in talking about the little boy. I've never heard of a better description of a ghost, have you? He's just watching, he's not there for real, but he's not pretend either. She's not just imagining it. He's there, but she knew that something wasn't quite right about it. I asked her about the little boy again sometime later, but she said she doesn't see him anymore. I told him I don't want him in my room. It's my room, and he's not with his mommy. He could get hurt. I don't want him in there. I asked, "Did he say anything to you? Is he going to stay away now?" She said, "No, he can't talk. He just looks sad at me, but he's not there now." She hasn't spoken of him except for those 2 instances. My husband was sleeping upstairs once when he heard footsteps start at the bottom of the stairs. He had actually just been lying in bed, not quite ready to get up, but not sleeping either. He thought the footsteps belonged to me, coming to drag him out of bed, and he lay there waiting to scare me with a pillow on top of his head as he often sleeps. The footsteps continued into the room and around to the far side of the bed. Still, he lay there, ready to scare me when I least expected it. He then felt weight on the bed, as if I had climbed onto it and was crawling over to wake him up. He told me he distinctly felt someone kneeling above him, and of course he assumed it was me. I was coming up to get him out of bed, but instead he was going to scare me half to death, and this was going to be hysterical in his mind. Just then he threw the pillow away from his face and yelled, ready to crack up when I screamed in fright. The problem was, he was alone in the room. completely and utterly alone, although he could still feel the weight on the bed and actually see the indentation where there should have been hands and knees to match. He yelled again, got up, and sprinted downstairs, where he grabbed a towel and looked at me and didn't say a word, then went back upstairs and stayed in the shower for some length of time. I went up to see what was going on, but he wouldn't tell me what happened. Later, he said he was just too freaked out to talk about it at the time, and just needed to calm down a bit before he talked to me about it. The occasional footsteps on the stairs have continued uninterrupted. Once a Ring Around the Rosie singing baby doll started singing on its own in the kids' room, and I couldn't make it stop. Although it was probably just a mechanical malfunction of some sort, it scared the hell out of me, and I threw the doll out the back door. To go into the kids' room to see who was up and playing at midnight only to be confronted by a singing doll laying undisturbed in the middle of the floor is a bit too much for me. We could still hear it after I threw it outside, so Michael retrieved it and took the mechanical insides of it out. He could be right. It could have just broken. It could have nothing to do whatsoever with this house. But when you have seen a toy break so that it turns itself on and off and then can't be turned off again, it can't happen. But it did, and it freaked me out. I half expected it to keep singing after he took it apart. And that's about all the incidents I can remember. As if that's not enough, right? Anyway, I decided to start keeping a journal of the strange goings-on at this house, to see how often things really happen here, because I know that, for instance, more happens when Michael is in the field for the Army, or now at his second job, but that I often forget to tell anyone about it. Later on, it just doesn't seem as real, or as important, or as believable. You tend to blow it off and forget about things. Now I'm curious to see how much really goes on in this house. The cats. Living in base housing during my time in Guam, my wife was into cats, and we had gotten 2 from an animal shelter. About a week later, the wife called me while I was at work, and she was freaking out. I couldn't understand what she was trying to tell me, so I asked the boss if I could go check on her. I got to the house, and she was sitting outside crying. After calming her down, I finally got the story out. She put these cats in the spare bedroom so she can mop the floors. But the trouble was, every time she turned around, both cats would be sitting behind her staring at her. Okay, I thought maybe she didn't latch the door. But no, she said that she had done it 3 times. The last time just making sure the door was latched, and using a chair under the knob to make sure the door stayed closed. Enter the dutiful husband. I went in the house and checked the spare room. No other way out but the back door. So I checked the door. It closed securely. I put the cats in that room and closed the door, walked down the hall into the living room, and turned around. The cats were in the hallway staring at me. I went back and checked the door, and it was still shut. So I'm now freaked out, and wife won't even come in the house. I put the cats in our bedroom, and that was fine. I tried one more time in that spare room, but when I walked backwards down the hall, keeping an eye on the door, I got to the living room, and those cats were in the middle of the floor staring at me. I took those damn cats back to the animal shelter, and we moved off base.